Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Today we're venturing deep into the heart of Texas, where the land is as vast as its legends and just as terrifying. From strange knocks in the dead of night to unsettling discoveries behind locked doors, get ready for 5 of the most disturbing true Airbnb stays in Texas that will make you question what's real and what's lurking just beyond the horizon. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing, and by doing so they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here the night is only getting started, and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now let's dive into the darkness. I booked the house because the photos showed light and distance, and a kind of careful cleanliness I never saw growing up. The listing said Montrose, but it was really on the edge where the streets pinch down and live oaks lean across like heavy eyebrows, where you can hear the hiss of traffic from 59 and the bayou depending on how the wind runs. I was in Houston for a 3-week contract on a network upgrade for a clinic, the kind of job that eats daylight and leaves you with the television glow and a drawer of takeout chopsticks. The house looked like a safe place to be tired in. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, fenced yard, off-street parking, smart lock and a bowl of mints. The first thing I noticed when I let myself in was the smell. Cold air from a hard-working unit carrying a faint sweetness, like dryer sheets and citrus peels. The second thing I noticed was the door. It was on the hallway between the 2 listed bedrooms, just past a built-in shelf where a cobalt vase sat empty. The door was painted the same agreeable off-white as the trim, with a brushed nickel knob that matched the rest of the house hardware, but the knob had no keyhole, only a small thumb turn that had been removed so that a blank circle peered back. I laid my palm on it, and the wood was cool. When I pushed gently it held. Not stuck but held, locked from the other side. In the listing photos there was a shot of the hallway with a runner rug and the same cobalt vase, but the angle had framed the wall so that the door would have been just out of view. It felt like a coincidence, and it felt like something else. I told myself it was a closet. I told myself the host kept cleaners or supplies there, or a network of smart home guts he did not want touched. I told myself to let it be, and for the first hours the house seemed happy enough to have me. The living room had a sectional that folded back against you like a dog that wanted your hand. The kitchen was compact but perfect, with a gas range that lit fast and a refrigerator that hummed above a whisper. The floors were old wood refinished, and they gave the faintest creak here and there as the air conditioning clicked on and off. The Wi-Fi was strong. The coffee was good. I sent a text to my contact at the clinic that I had arrived, and then to my ex that I had arrived, and watched both show delivered and nothing else. I set my bag in the front bedroom because it had the better morning light. The back bedroom was darker and closer to the bathroom. I opened the closet and found clean hangers and a folded extra blanket. I laid on the bed and let the weight of working air and travel hang there. I closed my eyes and must have slept because I woke to the strange quiet of a new place where every sound wants to be something. There was a faint tapping that took my half-awake brain a few seconds to file. The vent above the window had a short grill and the metal clicked when it cooled. There was the sound of a car passing and the whisper of leaves rubbing together and the tiny ticks of the house adjusting to being asked to hold another person. When I realized what my brain was doing, I laughed. You have to be careful with your mind in a place that does not know you yet. It will try to fill every gap. I went to H-E-B and bought sensible food and a bottle of good bourbon because I always tell myself I will have 1 glass at night to mark a boundary between work and sleep. The cashier asked about my day like it was a script. I came home through the dusk that Houston does well. Everything a warm slate and the edges of the world just barely on. A humid breath under the streetlights. I cooked an egg and a piece of toast and sat at the small dining table, and felt that particular private contentment of getting through the first day. When I washed my plate I looked down the hallway and saw the door again, and in that small moment the contentment soured. It is funny how the eyes can drag the heart. I went to the door and put my ear against it. There is a circulation of air in any house. The slow pressure shifts as vents open and close, as temperature and humidity argue. I heard that, and something else. It was so faint that you could say it was the air if you wanted to keep the night kind. A short, soft on and off like a sound someone makes when they forget to think about making it. A breath. I kept my ear there and waited. The house croaked an old board somewhere. A compressor kicked and hushed. The sound came again, soft and regular and close. I stepped back before my mind could run too far, which was still too late. I tapped the door twice with a knuckle and said hello without meaning to. The wood took my voice and gave me nothing back. I stood there longer than I want to write down, and then I forced myself to walk away and brush my teeth and set my phone to charge and turn out the light. When I lay down, the air felt heavier. At 3-something a sound woke me. Not a bang or a shout, not the crash of a dropped pan or the grinding of a stranger's car in the drive. It was the quick change from no breath in my ear to breath in my ear, which is to say the sound had begun again, and my head had placed it right beside me, though it was down the hall. If you have ever woken in a place that's not yours and reached for a lamp switch that is not where yours is, you know the small wet edge of panic. I sat up. My hand found my phone. I did not open the light. I sat and watched the rectangle of the doorway to the hall, and when the air conditioning shut off and the fan blade slowed, the house grew quiet enough to hear inside my own head, and I could hear it from the hallway, faint and even, like there was a person standing with their forehead against the wood. I got up and walked the hallway because what else do you do? I put my ear to the door and it was there. The small on and off of a person who was not pretending to sleep and not trying to frighten, only existing there. I thought about calling the host, and I thought about calling the police, and I thought about how ridiculous I would sound when a patrol car rolled up and 2 patient men came inside and stood where I stood and listened to a locked door breathe. I thought about someone who lived in the walls, which would be worse than a ghost because it would mean that a living body had been here hidden under the paper of other people's lives. I thought about all of it, and I fetched a chair from the dining table and wedged it under the doorknob and told myself that it was fine now because whatever was in there was locked and I had locked it more. In the morning the house was new again. Sunlight ran a finger along the floorboards. The smell in the kitchen was coffee and bread. I sent 2 emails that made me feel useful. When I glanced down the hallway it only looked like a hallway inconvenienced by a closed door. I told myself the air return must be in there and some duct made that sound when the fan cycled. I told myself I had been alone too long. I told myself to go to work and be among other voices, the fast and boring ones that keep your brain from doing what it does at night. That day Monica from the clinic joked about how thick the clinic walls were and how every contractor who walked in thought their phone had lost signal. She had good hands and a straightforward way, and when she laughed it made the day brighter, and by the time I was driving back I felt like the house could just be a place to sleep again. Before I went in, I crouched beside the foundation and looked along the line of vents and pipes and found nothing surprising. The siding was the kind of clapboard that looks straight at a glance and then shows its history up close. I followed the line of the house to where that hallway should be. A window for the back bedroom where the shade was new, a blank section of wall, then a smaller window higher up that might have been for a bathroom. If there was a room behind the door, it had no window, or it had one that had been taken and patched over with care. In Houston, you learn to respect what is inside walls because the city is always testing them with water. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, and a neighbor walking a pale dog nodded at me without the curiosity you might expect, like people standing and looking at wood or the least odd things the street sees. I ate standing up and washed the 2 dishes and walked the hallway and stood at the door and told myself I would not listen. I listened. The wood was cool, the breath was there, the same slow measure, in and out. I knocked again and said hello again, and heard only my own voice shrunken by the panel. I went back to the living room and turned on the television and tried to let the sounds that come in waves from a show drown the small steady proof that I was not alone. It worked until I turned the television off. The second night the breathing sounded closer. It is hard to explain how a sound that comes through wood can move, but it did from the right side of the door to the middle, like someone inside had leaned against the panels and was gently letting their weight ride there. I pulled the chair from under the knob and set it aside and put my hand on the door and spoke the way you speak to a wild animal. I told whoever it was that I would help if they needed help, and I said I would call the police if I had to, and I said that I did not want trouble. The sound did not change. I laid my forehead against the door and realized what I was doing and made my spine straight again. In the morning I messaged the host. I kept it polite and small. I said, "Hi there, quick question. What is the locked door in the hallway for?" He wrote back in less than a minute, "Utility access please keep closed. Let me know if you need anything else." I stared at the line until the typing dots appeared again. He sent another text, "If the door is sticking, feel free to put a doorstop in front of it. Nothing in there but pipes. Please don't try to open." He added a smiley that felt like a sticker put on a bruise. I went to work and tried to lose myself in the details of switch ports and label makers and making old things talk to new things without complaint. I told Monica about the host message and she made a face like maybe she did not like that answer. She said, "You know how some of these old houses are. They cut things in weird places. The new owners throw up a wall and call it innovation. Maybe they boxed in something they should have left." She said, "If it bugs you, come stay at my place a night." She had the kind of kindness that arrives with a frank look and no strings. I told her I was fine. I told her the door was fine. I told her I had slept well, and for the few hours before sleep I believed that I might. That night the breathing began before I turned off the living room lamp. It came like a practice exercise, steady, counting a pace I could not help but match. I set the lamp to a lower level and walked down the hallway and stood like a fool with my hand on the wood. The house offered its usual noises and the air whispered through vents and the breathing continued like a separate weather. I spoke again, and this time I said I needed the truth. I told the door that I would call the police. I told the door that I would call the host. I told the door I would end this as if it were a story that had obeyed me to this point and only needed a new line to close. When I stepped back, something touched the other side. Not a pound or a push. A fingertip. A simple single tap at the height of my chest, like a person lightly testing where the panel met my hand. I felt it through the wood. I did not feel fear rise like a tide or crash like a wave. It came like a sickness that had already been in me, and only now made itself known. I went to the kitchen and took a heavy breath, and then another, and took the bourbon down and poured half a glass and set it down without drinking. I found the toolkit under the sink that held the spare light bulbs, and the cheap screwdriver, and a stubby hammer and a roll of blue tape. I took the screwdriver, and returned to the door and tried the screws on the hinge. They held. I tried the screws on the plate where the thumb turn had been, and two backed out with a squeal. When I eased the small metal disc away, a neat round hole looked back. I set my eye there. There was nothing at first, then the shape of darkness at a depth that did not make sense. It was not a closet close behind the door or the narrow shaft for a utility chase. The light from the hallway should have spilled a little, but it sank like poured ink. In the dark was the suggestion of a deeper interior, not made of studs and insulation, but of distance measured in something other than inches. The breath came right against the hole, as if a mouth nearly touched the wood. It fogged the edges of the hole for a second, and the fog was cold. I pulled back, and the hallway swam and steadied. I walked to the front bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and tried to decide what kind of fear I had. You should name it if you can. Was it the fear of a person hiding in a space I could not see, a person thin as hunger wedged in the bones of the house? Was it the fear of a trick, a small speaker playing heartbeats or breath, a prank by a host who had found an economy of cruelty? Or was it the fear that the house had a shape that did not match the exterior, that its inside had been made wrong in some initial pouring, and now the edges did not meet, and in the gap something old had learned to wait? I sat there and remembered my father telling me to never stand too close to the edge of the Sabine because the bank looked sure and then gave way. I thought of edges. I thought of the breath against my eye. I slept in the living room with the television on, and woke twice with my heart running. At 6 I turned everything off and sat in the kitchen and watched the light come up. My phone showed a text from my ex sent at 1:20 a.m. that said sorry, then a second that said meant to send that to my sister. There is a kind of humor to living that none of us ask for. I made coffee. I wrote the host again and said I needed to get into the utility space because the breathing did not seem normal. He replied with a longer message about liability and building codes and maintaining property safety and how there was nothing inside to inspect. He offered me a refund for the 2 nights remaining if I chose to leave early. I stared at that and felt a small shift. He knew the number of nights I had left. Of course, hosts know that. It still felt like a man counting down with me. At lunch I drove out to a hardware store and bought a cheap borescope camera with a phone adapter. I told myself this was reasonable. I told myself I would put it through the hole and see ductwork and a narrow chase and feel foolish and come home and sleep with a clean head. I told myself the truth might be ugly, but at least it would be measurable. When I got back, the air felt thicker in the hallway. I knelt and fit the tiny camera into the hole and eased the cable in 1 inch, then 2, then more, and watched my phone show black. I turned the small LEDs up. The screen brightened a little and I saw particles drifting, slow like dust in water rather than air. I pushed the cable further and saw nothing until the edge of the frame showed something white. It was the curve of a wall, but not drywall. The light ran on it without finding texture. The cable trembled slightly and the picture shifted and a smear of dark came close. It took me a second to understand what my eyes saw. The surface rippled and then smoothed, like skin that had a slow thought. I pulled the camera back too fast, and the cable jounced against the inside of the hole and the picture stuttered. For an instant the frame showed the idea of a small shape hanging from the white surface, as if a tooth were budding from a gum. The breath filled my ear though it was coming through the wood and the hole and the wire and the screen. I stood without meaning to. I dropped the camera and it swung and tapped the baseboard. The door did not move. The breath did. It slowed, then paused, then continued, a little louder. The house was quiet except for the unit and the tiny sound of my phone trying to refocus into a picture it had not been built to understand. I gathered the cable and put it on the dining table and sat with my hands flat. I am not a fanciful person. I have not seen things. I have been wrong plenty. I have made a mess of my life in ways that were completely ordinary. This felt outside that. I tried to make a plan and the only plan that felt like something a sane person would do was to leave. I packed without making noise because not making noise is what you do when you feel watched. I put my bag by the door and then thought about Monica and how if I left without telling anyone, and if something later was found it would be my name in a story said by someone else. I went to the hallway again because I could not go. The air was cooler there, the way a long polished desk can be cool where no sun touches. I put my ear to the door and did not hear breathing first. I heard a new sound, the short wet click a mouth makes when it opens after resting. Then came the breath, deeper now, and a second after it, another breath, fainter and higher, like a child trying to teach himself how to match a parent. I stepped back and the wood made a small sound under my feet and the second breath stopped and the first grew rough and then both were quiet. The unit hummed and the refrigerator clicked and the minute in the hallway was 3 hours long. I went to the front door and put my hand on the deadbolt and did not turn it because the structure of my body did not allow a signal to pass from my mind to my hand. I stood there until I could move, and then I opened the door and stood on the small porch and let the outside air push on my face. A man across the street set a bag of trash beside a can and glanced at me like he expected me to belong. A truck passed and the driver's arm hung out his window and the wrist was stained with oil and sun and it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in days. I walked to my car and unlocked it, and then locked it again and came back inside because leaving felt like leaving something half done and I have never been good at that. I poured a drink and did not drink it, and texted Monica and said I might take you up on that couch tonight. She said sure, and then said everything okay. I wrote yes and then deleted it, and wrote, I think the house has a room that was left out of the listing, and she sent back a skull emoji, and then said seriously, are you okay? I said I will be. I said can I come by after 9? She said she would leave a light on and that I had to bring Colacus in the morning as payment. I told her done, and then all I had to do was wait for dark. In that waiting I made a small mistake. I went back to the hole. I do not know why. Curiosity, or the logic that if I meant to leave I should look once more and know what I was leaving. I bent and put my eye to the small circle expecting darkness, and there instead was my eye looking back. Not a reflection, because the light and angle were wrong for that. It was my eye, but too close, as if the space inside the door had moved forward to erase distance. I could see the blood vessels and the tiny sclera flecks and the way my pupil widened. Then it widened more, but mine did not. The one inside the hole did. I jerked away hard enough that my shoulder threw against the jamb. The whole door shook softly. The house made a noise like a person clearing their throat. I packed the camera and my charger and my toothbrush because taking those things felt like choosing to live, and I moved to the front door, and because I am a fool I took one more long look down the hallway. The hallway looked back. I do not mean the door moved or the floorboards opened. I mean that the bright square at the end seemed to hold a person's posture the way water will briefly hold the shape of a fish. I could feel a gaze. It did not come from a height that matched mine. It came from lower and just inside the frame, exactly where the knob would be on the other side. It felt like being at an aquarium when something large comes to the glass and you realize the glass is the only reason your mind still fits in your body. I left. I locked the door, because I could not decide if locking it was keeping the house safe from the street or the street safe from the house. At Monica's, the shared air of another person made sleep do what it is supposed to do. In the morning, we ate glazed rings of sugar and bread and drank too much coffee, and I told her some of it. Not the eye, not the skin. Enough that a person would suggest the police. She did, and she was right, and I promised to call. I did not. I wrote the host instead and said there was something wrong and I was leaving, and he could keep the last 2 nights of payment. He sent a message that was longer and warmer, and more careful. He said he understood that sometimes older homes made sounds that were unfamiliar. He said he was sorry for any discomfort. He said he would send someone to check that everything was in order, and that I should leave the key on the table. He did not use the word refund again. He did not ask what I had heard. Work went on. People at the clinic complained and then thanked me, which is the cycle. Monica squeezed my arm in the hallway once and I felt the ridiculous ache of wanting to cry in a beige corridor that smelled like hand sanitizer. I drove back to the house after that, not inside, only to look. I wanted to be sure I had left it in the world, and not to some other place it seemed to belong to. A different car sat in the driveway. I felt a mix of relief and guilt, relief that the house had swallowed someone else. Guilt that I had let it. I parked across the street and watched the windows. In the front room, the glow of a television moved. In the kitchen, a silhouette passed and stopped and passed again. The small, busy movement of a person setting up a new life for a short time. At dusk, I sat there longer than I should have. A stranger in a blue sedan watching a small house watch me back. The air was a wet blanket. A thunderhead stacked up far to the west and the light went the color of a dull penny. A sound rose, a steady cicada scream that makes heat audible. In the dark, the silhouette in the kitchen paused and turned toward the hallway, and I felt my hand move on the steering wheel, as if to help. The person took a step and another, and then passed out of frame. I waited. The television glow did the slow flicker of a scene change, and the cicada screamed and the thunderhead muttered somewhere, and I waited until the porch light snapped on, and the person appeared at the door and stepped out. A woman in gym shorts and a tank top and a phone in her hand, the pattern of animation you see when someone is texting to make sense of something they do not yet have words for. She stood on the porch and her head tipped a little as if she were listening not to a sound but to the absence of it. She typed, she waited. She looked down the hallway again, and then went back inside, and the porch light stayed on. I drove away. I did not go back to Monica's that night because her kindness made me feel like a person again, and I did not know if I could hold that without dropping it. I went to a motel along the freeway, where the air smelled like disinfectant and bodies, and I slept with a light on, and dreamed of floorboards opening like mouths. In the morning I got up and went to the clinic and did what people do when they have to keep moving in a world that does not have a chapter break for them. I did not check the listing. I did not drive down that street. I thought maybe this was how you beat something like that. You starve it of attention. A week went by. Then 2. I was assigned to a different site out by Westheimer, and at lunch I was in my car eating a sandwich when the news app on my phone showed a small local story about a neighborhood complaint. An embedded video showed a woman I recognized in front of a house that I recognized. She was angry in the way people get when something made them feel small and they do not want to feel small again. She said she had rented a place and there had been a locked utility door that the host would not open, and that at night she heard someone in there. The comments ran the usual course from sympathy to mocking to the kind of bored cruelty that the internet grows like mold and damp. The host had commented too, a long soft reply about building codes and safety and the dangers of spreading misinformation about people's homes. He said the guests had been offered refunds. He said no one had been harmed. That would have been the end of it for me if not for the last frame of the video. The camera panned to show the hallway, quick, like the person filming knew they were not supposed to, and for 1 second the light caught the door and the hole where the thumb turn had been. It was not a hole anymore. A nickel had been glued there shiny side out, Washington looking as if he had been pressed against the wood to listen. I stared at that, and the coin showed my small reflection, and behind my reflection the idea of movement. The clip ended. The app offered me more news. That night at the motel, something woke me. It was not the house. It could not be. I was a different person in a different place with a different light switch and a worse bed. I lay there, and in the thin drywall of the motel, in the seam where the 2 rooms met, there was a sound. It was faint and even and human. In and out. In and out. Like someone had found the shared line between spaces and learned how to breathe through it. I put my hand on the wall and felt nothing and felt everything, and it took all of my strength not to give that sound a timetable and a name. I moved to a different motel, then a different one. I told myself this was adult life and I was adapting. I finished the contract, and there was talk of renewing, and I knew that if I stayed, the city would take me in a way I was not ready for. I drove north and the trees thinned and the air got drier and the sky widened, and for a time I felt the simple animal relief of distance. I slept with the windows open in a place that had no shared walls, and I did not hear breath. I heard crickets and a fox once, and the slow truck of a neighbor leaving for work before sunrise. I kept the borescope in my bag, and I do not know why. I moved it from bag to bag as if it were toothpaste. I did not look at the footage on my phone because the system had never saved it. It had been one long stream into my eye. The absence of the file felt more real than its presence would have. Months later I checked the listing out of a hunger I pretended was curiosity. It was still up. The photos looked the same. The angle in the hallway did not include the door. The reviews were mostly fine, and a few mentioned sounds at night in a way that couched the fear as a joke. One said we laughed because we thought someone was in the closet. Another said bring earplugs, if you are a light sleeper. One said we heard the house breathing. The host replied to each with warm apologies and notes about older homes and their quirks. The most recent review was short. It said we cut our trip short. We did not sleep. I could have written my own review. I could have added weight to whatever scale people use to choose or run. I did not. If I wrote it, it would mean I was still in that hallway. If I did not write it, it meant other people would be. I try not to make ethical math at midnight, because I will always come up short. I closed the app and went to the sink and ran the water and let the sound fill my head, and when I turned the tap off, the silence that followed held nothing, and I cried then quietly, in a place where no one knew my name. Last week Monica called to tell me she had taken a new job, better pay, less chaos, the kind of adult move that should be celebrated. We talked and laughed and avoided the places where our words would go soft. At the end her voice changed shape. She said, "Hey, by the way, they're doing construction on that block in Montrose, the one you were on. Some developer bought 3 houses together and they are knocking them down." She said it like good news because it was. I thanked her for telling me, and told myself that this would close it. Concrete and steel would scrape away whatever was wrong. A new shape would be stamped where the old one had buckled. I watched a video that a neighbor posted from across the street, excavators with jaws that bit, dust rising in the kind of plumes you see when a big animal lies down hard. The machines made the board walls into toothpicks and the toothpicks into mulch. When the machine reached the section of the hallway, the operator paused and leaned out of the cab and looked down the length of his arm at something the camera could not show. He lowered the jaw and the wall gave way, and behind it was not a small boxed-in utility closet with pipes, not a narrow chase with insulation, and a nameless smell. The video shook because the person filming did not expect a room, and there was a room. It was windowless and white in the sense that milk is white. The walls were smooth. The floor was smooth. The space was wrong the way a word mispronounced is wrong. There were marks where people had touched, the faint smudges of oil from hands arranged in a line along the wall at about shoulder height. In the video you could not hear breathing, of course, because the engine was loud and the operator was cussing under it all, but you could see the excavator pause again as if the man inside could. The camera panned without meaning to, and for a second it caught a shape that jutted from the wall near the floor in a way that looked like a growth. It was small and the angle hid it, and then the jaw came down and the wall folded and the room disappeared like a dream. The person filming said, "Well damn," and the clip ended. I watched it a dozen times until the compression made it a smear of pixels. I tried to tell myself that I had closed the circle. I did not feel closed. I felt watched. I shut the laptop and sat at the table in the rented place I am in now and listened to the clean sound of a refrigerator doing its job. I told myself the new developers would pour their slab and put in their cable chases and string their lights and sell a kind of safety to a kind of buyer who might even find it for a while. I drank water. I stood in the doorway to my bedroom and looked down the short hall. There is a closet there with louvered doors that whisper when you slide them, and behind them is a crawl of shelves with towels and a vacuum, and I know it because I put those things there with my own hands. I stood there and my body remembered the shape of standing and listening, and I laughed because memory is not your friend. Then I heard it. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was the most natural sound a person can make. It came from the louvered doors and was not muffled by them, because the slats are not meant to muffle. In and out. In and out. Not a man or a woman, not a child, an age so simple it did not matter. I stepped forward and my hand found the slats and my fingers slid into the grooves the way fingers do when you are about to open something you love. The breath paused. It waited. In the soft pause I understood that the house on the edge of Montrose had not been the source so much as the shape that allowed the sound to collect. You can destroy a shape. You cannot undo the habit of something that has learned how to move through walls. I took my hand away and stood very still. The breath began again. It was patient. It had all the time in the world. I did not open the closet because I already knew what was not inside. I went to the kitchen and turned on the faucet and listened to water. I called Monica and told her the story from the beginning for the first time, every ugly piece in order, and she did not try to fix it or to tell me it was fine. She stayed on the phone until the sun came up and the sound receded and the birds replaced it with their own small insistence. When I hung up I put a chair under the closet knobs because the body wants gestures even if they are not useful. Then I sat and wrote this. I am writing it without breaks and without cleverness because that is the only way I know how to get it out of me, line by line like pulling thread from a wound. The sun is up now and the room is full of daylight, and I am laughing again because the breath inside the closet sounds like mine. It matches the exact rise and fall when I am quiet. It stops when I hold my breath. It slows when I make myself slow. You might think that would make it ordinary. It does not, it makes it worse. I am not going to move tonight. I will sit here and wait out the hours with a light on and the faucet running enough to make a tiny river. In a day or a week I will tell myself to be brave and I will take the chair away and open the louvered doors and I will see shelves and towels and a vacuum and the shape of the space I already know is there, and I will put my hand into the air of the closet and feel nothing. I will laugh and go to bed. At 3-something I will wake to the quick change from no breath in my ear to 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 breath. I will put my ear to the wall, not because I want to hear it but because I need to know where it is. It will be there and it will not. It will follow me the way a shadow follows once you learn where to look. It is patient. It has all the time in the world. We picked the little house because it looked like a place that once belonged to someone's grandmother and had been rinsed in white paint and optimism. The listing called it a private stay in South Austin, with old oak shade, a fenced yard for dogs, and a short drive to Barton Springs. It was north of St. Elmo, on a quiet street where the mailboxes leaned the way hip bones do under thin skin, where the cicadas started before sunset, and did not stop until your nerves wore thin enough to see light through them. The photos showed a perfectly made bed, and a bowl of green limes, and a record player that no one under 60 had ever learned to fix. The description said the host was remote and responsive. We read that as kind and far away, the way you do when you want a place to feel like yours for a few days. We had been fighting in low gear for months, me and Jonah, not the kind of fighting that breaks plates or draws neighbors to windows, more the kind that erodes something invisible. We had decided to use a long weekend to pretend we did not know how to hurt each other with small, practiced motions. Austin felt like a compromise, familiar enough to not feel like an error, big enough to disappear in for a while. He said he wanted tacos at a place that only did barbacoa on Saturdays. I said I wanted to swim if the water did not smell like bruised leaves. We did not say that we wanted to be different people for 3 nights. The house had a keyless entry, and the code worked the first time. The air inside was a cool slap and smelled like an overachieving candle had been blown out in the kitchen. The living room held a sofa that was proud of being mid-century, and a rug that was new enough to pretend it did not know feet yet. The bedroom had a window unit in addition to the central air, which told me someone had once sweated here and been told to deal with it, then bought a machine that would hum them to sleep anyway. A hallway ran past the bathroom and ended in a closet with a louvered door. Above it, a square cut in the ceiling held the attic hatch, a panel of painted plywood with a loop of twine stapled to the middle like a throat. I noticed it because the twine was not centered. It had been pulled and not let back. The hatch sat a little proud on one corner, a quiet asymmetry you would miss if you were not the sort of person who catalogued small wrongnesses for later. When I set our bag in the bedroom, I opened the closet beside the hatch. The smell that licked out was old house smell, hot wood and dust that had been places you would never see, but there was another thread in it, the faint sweet of a polyurethane finish still off-gassing years after it had been rolled on. The top shelf was empty, except for a roll of blue painter's tape and a little folded pile of earplugs still in their wrappers, the kind they hand out at festivals, when you forgot to think about your hearing. I put my hand on the wall, and the plaster gave back coolness like a held breath. We did the ritual. We opened cabinets. We noted the knife sharpness. We tested the shower pressure, and let the hot water run long enough to make the mirror sweat. Jonah turned on the record player, and the platter turned obediently with a rubber belt's tired grace, and the needle skipped once, and then settled into a dust-scratched guitar that made us both smile without looking at each other. He took the front yard photo for his mother because she believes in porches like some people believe in saints. I texted the host to say we were in and everything looked great. The host, whose name on the app was a neat first name with no photo, replied almost instantly with a smiley face and a note that he lived nearby if we needed anything, but he respected privacy to the point of invisibility. I thumbed back a thank you and felt the little prickle in my neck that comes when someone says exactly what you want to hear in a way that makes you look around for a witness. We went out and did the things you do to convince your bodies that they could live somewhere else if asked. We ate shredded beef on tortillas you cannot get right north of here. We walked down South Congress in the heat that never fully leaves and pretended the boots in the windows were for us. We stood on the bridge and watched people line up with cameras for bats, and then left before the swarm because we have learned to leave some grand gestures to other people. In the dark we drove back through a neighborhood where the houses looked like they were learning how to be expensive. The porch lights were warm and the mosquitoes were heavier than the air. It was inside with the bedroom lamp on, and the record player off, that the house began to tell us how it sounded when no one was talking. There was the soft rush of air through the vent and the small knocks of ducks remembering they used to be flat. There was the distant hum of an outdoor unit, and the neighbor's muffled television, and the sharp, quick scuttle of a gecko agreeing with the wall. Then there was a sound we had not heard in any other house, and could not name, a hush that was not the air, and not the flat line of silence. It was thin and patient and came from above, the kind of tiny scrape that furniture pads make when two legs lift and one stays to gasp against a floor. We both stilled the way prey animals do when a branch snaps. Jonah had a glass of water in his hand and I could hear the meniscus tremble. The sound came again and I felt my tongue go dry as if the air up there had pulled the moisture. When you are in a strange house and there is an attic, you think of raccoons, squirrels, roof rats, the gray parade of things with hands. You do not think of a person in the first 15 seconds, because your life would tilt too fast if you did. Jonah set his glass down too carefully, and his eyes flicked toward the hallway. I said probably a squirrel, and he said sure without volume, which is one of the ways we have learned to be kind. It took a while to fall asleep, which might be the most normal thing about that first night. At some soft hour, the unit kicked and then the pitch slid down as if remembering something, and I woke to the feeling that a sound had stopped rather than begun. I lay and let my breath slow in layers, and then I heard it again. It was not scraping this time, not the sound of hard little feet. It was the clean weight of a step placed deliberately on boards, one, then another after a measure that felt like counting. Above us, not far. The kind of footfall you feel in the bolts of the house and not only here. I let my hand find Jonah's, and he squeezed without moving anything else, and I felt the small tremor in him that matched mine. We did not speak because words would have changed something we did not know how to keep steady. When morning pressed against the blinds, the fear felt like embarrassment dressed in sweat. The attic hatch had not moved. The twine lay a little askew as it had before. I climbed on the chair from the dining nook and pressed my fingertips to the corner that had lifted and felt the flex and set of wood that has been pulled and put back. Jonah stood below me with his hands out as if to catch me or pull me down, and neither of us laughed at the posture. I lowered the hatch slowly, and the ladder unfolded, new aluminum that whined when it extended. The air that fell was the kind you forget exists in this city until you open something sealed, hot, static, punitive, soaked with cedar dust and the leavings of years. I coughed and Jonah said maybe don't, and I said I just want to look, and he said okay in a way that meant he would follow me to places he did not want to be. We climbed with a flashlight that did not need to be as bright as we had bought and found the space that every attic is when you write it down. The rafters made triangles like a child's drawing. The insulation lay like dirty snow. The roof nails pushed tiny constellations of rust into the air with each ripple of heat. There were no droppings in the paths between joists, no nests of shredded paper, no overturned bins. There was a row of plastic storage tubs in a neat line along the far side, all labeled in a precise hand with painter's tape. Winter, books, kitchen, tools. A narrow plywood catwalk ran just off-center like the heart line in a palm. Near the hatch a small square of wood had been cut and screwed back in place and then painted over. A repair tidy enough to make me think of a person doing a thing they were ashamed of with as much care as they could manage. We stood there and the silence pressed on our teeth, and then somewhere near the ridgeline the wood made the quick musical pop of expansion. Both of us flinched and smiled at each other for flinching. We stepped carefully along the planks and I crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the insulation and brought them up gritty with fiberglass and black flecks. There were marks where someone had knelt recently. You could say they were mine, except they ran ahead of me. Shallow bowls pressed into the pink, the little troughs that knees leave when you try not to put your entire weight down. I looked at Jonah and his face had become the face he wears when my job sends me into crawl spaces or server closets hung with a thicket of orphan wires, and we both know there is no good way to back out. We did not find anything you could hold up, no nest, no bedroll, no neat pile of water bottles that would let a story end at a police station with a statement and a sigh. It was only the suggestion of weight and the faintest smell of hair, human or animal. It was hard to tell. I lifted one of the tubs and felt the drag of tape give, and I stopped because this was not our home and even curiosity has rules. We put the ladder back and closed the hatch, and both of us went straight to the kitchen and ran water because the sound reset our heads to a safer frequency. I texted the host. He replied fast with a line that made us look at each other again. He wrote that the attic had been sealed and that city code prohibited guest access for safety and insurance reasons, and he asked me politely to keep it closed. He said Austin critters sometimes sounded larger than their bodies, and that he had bait boxes outside because he believed in treating living things with respect. He did not ask what we had heard. He did not ask if we were all right. He did not mention that the hatch had not been sealed. We went out that afternoon and let the city distract us with the things it does for free. We walked the greenbelt until the shade cooled us enough to remember we had skin. We watched a heron fish in water that looked like a bottle left in a refrigerator drawer. We stood under a bridge on South Lamar and read declarations of love and promises to return written in Sharpie by people who had not kept them or had. For an hour we were two people not being watched by anything except the sun, and we were almost kind again. At dusk we sat in the backyard at the little picnic table under the live oak. The cicadas started up and the tree rained dry skins like paper flowers, and for a minute the yard felt like a stage set and we were the only actors who had shown up to rehearsal. The house had a second structure behind the fence, a narrow shed with a new lock on a hasp. The grass around it was pressed down in two parallel tracks that could have been anything: a wheelbarrow, a gardener. Jonah nodded toward it and I said probably tools, and he said the listing said no garage access, and I said this was a shed, and he laughed, which meant he had fought the urge to correct me and let it go. When full dark came, the attic woke up. The house let us know by degrees, the way a person you live with will move around you before speaking. A just perceptible thud over the hallway, then another over the kitchen, as if the weight above us were mapping our rooms in slow motion. I sat on the sofa and felt the cushion answer my body and looked at the ceiling and wished it were clear. Jonah stood in the hallway with his head tilted, listening and not liking that he was. We do not own a gun. We own the sort of logic that tells you most noises do not include intent. He lifted the chair from the dining nook and propped it under the attic hatch the way people in older movies do with a doorknob when the script wants you to understand that a thin piece of wood is the only thing between you and the world. We slept again, because your body will take what it can. But I woke to something I had never heard in any house, and hope not to hear again. It was the almost sound that hair makes when a head passes close to fabric, multiplied by the volume of a ceiling, an intimate whisper broad enough to fill a room. It came from directly above our bed, a sweep, then another, as if someone had crawled flat on their belly and was inching forward with their face to the sheetrock, listening for the shape of our breathing and wanting to match it. I thought I could pretend it was an animal, until the second sweep paused, and a shallow hitch followed, the restrained exhale through a nose. It was a human sound because my body knew it before my mind admitted it. My mouth went open, and nothing came out. Jonah's hand found mine in the dark, and his fingers dug without asking for permission. It is strange what you think of in the moments when something pure happens, not joy or terror, but the kind of clarity that scrapes. I thought of the host's line about respecting privacy to the point of invisibility, and the phrase folded in on itself and made a new meaning. I thought of the blue painter's tape and the earplugs. I thought of the neat tubs and the tidy repair. I thought of the shed and the two little tracks in the grass, and I thought of a man, or a woman, or something without a name, flat as a letter in a mailbox, stretched between joists, hearing the metronome of our hearts and wanting to make a song out of it. We did not confront it that night. We lay and did the math of until dawn, until trucks, until the world made a noise that would move a thing like this to whatever corner it came from. When the window went gray, the sounds receded, as if the house had inhaled and then remembered it did not need to. I got up light-headed and went straight to the front door and stepped out into air that smelled like wet pavement even though none had fallen. A woman walked a corgi with a tail like a question mark, and nodded at me, and I nodded back and realized my face had arranged itself into a smile that made my cheeks ache. We ate breakfast at a place with a chalkboard menu, and employees who meant their tattoos. I did not taste the eggs. Jonah watched my hands tremble when I lifted the coffee and set it down. He said we should tell someone, and I said who, and he said the host, and I shook my head and saw the waitress see me shake it and look away. He said police, and I thought of 2 officers in an attic pointing with flashlights at the spots we had made, and then down at my hands. I said, what do we tell them? That a house had breath. He said a person is up there, and when he said the word person, my heart put both hands on either side of it and pressed. Back at the house, I typed the kind of message you write when you want the force of law, but are too civilized to say so. I wrote that there had been footsteps, and that we had both heard them, and that this was a safety concern. I wrote that we would be leaving a night early, and that we wanted the host to check the attic before anyone else stayed. I wrote that it might be an animal, which was the kindest lie I could manage. The host wrote back with concern and reassurance in balanced measures. He said he was sorry to hear we were uncomfortable, and that he would have his handyman check the perimeter and the roof, and that he had never had reports like this before. He said the attic had recently been rensulated, and perhaps some boards were settling. He said he would process a partial refund, and that we were welcome back any time. He did not use an exclamation point. He did not say he lived nearby this time. We decided to leave at dusk because neither of us wanted to admit that we did not want to meet nighttime here again. We put things back where we had found them, our little ritual of absolution, and I went to the closet and stood under the hatch the way a person stands beneath a church fresco and tries not to tilt. I put the chair aside and pulled the twine and lowered the panel and unfolded the ladder, because I could not make my body leave without looking. Jonah stood at the bottom step as if catching me might be his body's last function. I climbed slowly, and the temperature rose like a hand placed on the back of my neck. The attic did not meet us with a sound. It met us with a fact. The tubs had all been moved 2 feet to the left, not by a bump or a raccoon. The line was too straight. A rope lay coiled beside them that had not been there before, the hemp stiff with something that had dried in spots and gone darker than the fiber. Next to the coil was a plastic grocery sack tied shut with careful loops. I reached for it, and Jonah said no, and I said I am not opening it, and I did not need to say I have to know it is not a cat. I pinched the knot and looked through the plastic. It was full of hair, long, short, in tangles, brown and gray and yellow like straw, a mass taken from brushes or drains, and saved in a way that would make a stranger walk backward with their hands held up, which I did, because that was what I had become. That was enough. We closed the panel, and we did what scared people have always done. We left. We took our bag, and a water bottle, and the small piece of ourselves that had not yet adjusted to a new shape. I locked the door, and the lock trilled the mechanical chirp people mistake for security. When we got to the car, a man was walking down the sidewalk, carrying a bucket and a long-handled brush. He was in his late 40s, maybe, with the kind of tan that does not come from recreation. He wore a baseball cap with a beer logo bleached nearly to a ghost. He nodded and said evening, and his eyes dropped once to the key in my hand and back up. He kept walking toward the house, and then turned in through the gate without slowing, and went around back where the hose spigot was. I looked at Jonah, and he looked at me, and for a breath we did not move. The water started, and then the brush made the quiet rasp of soapy circles on siding, and I could see from the angle of his arm that he was scrubbing the lower part of the back wall hard. He worked like a man who had done this a lot. He did not look up. He did not look at us. He simply erased whatever had been there from waist height down, while the cicadas sang. We stood rooted, two people who had planned to be braver than this, and then I said, "Excuse me." My voice had the wobble of a person on day 2 after a car accident. He glanced up with a fast, even smile that did not touch his eyes and said, "Oh hey, just getting the mildew off before the next rain. This wall catches it." "Are you the host?" I asked, and even as I said it I knew the host we had messaged did not have this man's face. He tilted his head and considered and said, "I keep an eye on the place, the owners in and out. He's not great with ladders." He said the last part with a small upward tone that invited me to accept the arrangement, because it would be easier if I did. Jonah said, "We're checking out early," and the man nodded and said, "Yeah, I figured." He went back to scrubbing, and turned the hose higher, and the water arced into the grass with its heavy little percussion, and in the arc I saw a streamer of brown hair catch and hang for a second against the fence pickets before sliding down. We did not sleep in Austin that night. We drove north and east until the road unspooled us into a motel that smelled like a bottle left open too long. We lay on a bed that had known other bodies in the unkind way motel beds do, and stared at a ceiling that revealed nothing. In the morning, Jonah showed me his phone. He had searched the address and the owner's name, which he had pulled from the county records. The owner was a trust, as they often are now, and the mailing address was a P.O. box. Then he searched the host's name on the app, and there was little except reviews, and the angle of a life kept to a corridor. He looked like a man trying to hold his breath for hours. I felt the twin to his panic in my own chest. We said we would let it go, and then we tried to. A week later, it was a link a friend sent in a group thread that we do not silence, because you are supposed to let other people gently interrupt you. The link was to a neighborhood forum, one of those digital cul-de-sacs where people barter lawn chairs and talk about the mail. Someone had posted photos of a man moving along the ridgeline of a roof at dusk. The caption said "Raccoon Guy back" or something else. The face in the grain was the shape of a man's head beneath a cap, the kind that could be anyone if you wanted it to be. Another person posted that their attic hatch had been pulled down in the night, and they had assumed it was heat, but then found footprints in the dust that did not match their shoe tread. A third said to stop spreading rumors, because the block had been safe for years. A fourth wrote that the little white house on their street had a new host who wouldn't give a real name. And then a comment that made my stomach turn offered a photo of a man carrying a bucket and a long-handled brush around a fence, the same neutral gait, the same beer cap, the same sun-thickened forearm hair catching light like silver. The caption under that one said, "The handyman's thorough, I'll give him that. He power-washed our back steps without us even asking. He's a ghost. I never see him come or go." The word stuck. Ghost. I am not a person who believes in anything that can be disproved with a solid counterexample. I know air pressure and wood expansion, and the way mice in a wall can make a sound big enough to rewire a marriage. I know about men who think proximity is a kind of claim. I also know what it feels like when something outside the long ledger of ordinary bends near you and tastes the heat off your sleeping face. When I say ghost here, I mean the overlap, the thing that is both man and habit, a person whose body was not where it should have been, and left a shape behind that learned to keep moving. We went back to Austin once more because the city has a way of calling you when you think you have finished with it. We did not go to the house. We did not drive down that street. We parked near a coffee shop on South First and pretended that what had happened to us was just a story we could tell with a tone that made other people lean in. The barista had a nail through an ear that must have hurt like Faith going in. I ordered something with too much ice and listened to the way other people arranged their mornings. A man in a software shirt was telling a woman about a house he had bought, and how the inspector had missed the squirrel nest in the attic. He laughed and she did not. She stirred her drink exactly 5 times clockwise, and then stopped because she had trained herself to stop. On the way back to the car, Jonah touched my elbow, gentle, and pointed down an alley to where a blue recycling bin sat half in shadow. The bin looked like every other bin, except that on the inside of the lid someone had glued a small round mirror, the cheap kind they sell for blind spots. The mirror caught the light and returned it to us warped, and for a second the alley opened wide in that little circle, and then folded again. Above the bin, a window with a cracked corner had been repaired with clear tape laid down perfectly straight by a patient hand. On the sill inside there was a bowl. The bowl was full of hair. We could have called someone. We did not. We did what people do who do not want to be written down on a form with their home addresses. We left, and went home, and invented new routines that would let us sleep. We put a chair under our own attic hatch for 2 weeks, until the stupid part of us felt stupid and took it away. We argued less and touched more because fear, when you can stand it, is a luxury that teaches you what to hold near. It worked until one night in early fall when the unit kicked on, and the pitch dipped just so, and I woke to a sound in my own house that was not my house's sound. It was a hush broad enough to fill a room, and then the shallow hitch through a nose. It came from above the bed, and for a second my body told me what my mind would not. I reached over and felt Jonah's ribs lift slow under my hand, and I counted his breaths to keep mine from breaking, and in between each number I heard the other, a metronome that had followed us through freeway miles and apartments and rented spaces, and the story we had tried to close with motion alone. In the morning, I climbed our ladder with a flashlight and a mouth gone dry. The attic was our attic. Boxes of winter coats, a crate of old paperbacks, a coil of Christmas lights that we always mean to throw out. The dust lay undisturbed, except where my own knees had made twin moons. There were no footprints that were not ours, no tub moved by 2 feet, no rope, no bag. At the far corner, where the roof angle cuts too low for comfort, a small patch of insulation had a groove in it, the kind your hand makes when you drag it without meaning to. I shone the light there, and something caught and flashed. I reached and felt the familiar prickle of fiberglass, and then the metal edge of a little round thing lodged in the pink. I pulled it out between 2 fingers as carefully as I have ever done anything, and held it to the lamp. It was a mirror, the cheap blind spot kind, the adhesive backing still gummy with dust. My hand shook. I was not surprised. I had been expecting it since the alley without knowing I was. I wrapped it in a rag, and took it downstairs and put it on the table and sat and waited for Jonah to wake, because I did not want to hand it to him in the dark and make him live in my head. When he came into the kitchen and saw my face, he did not ask what was wrong the way some men do because they need a shape to fold their arms around. He sat, and I unwrapped the little circle and set it in his palm, and watched his mouth go tight in a way that meant if I touched him, I would feel the tremor. I told him about the groove in the insulation, and he said we could move, and I said we could, and we did not mean it. You never finish moving. You just change where you are when the noises come. I started hearing other stories after that because I began to listen in the key that tuned to them. A woman in my office said her mom had found old Polaroids in an attic, angles of rooms from above, the white squares stained with something that looked like tea. A man at the dog park told me he had woken to his hatch down, and a footprint on the arm of his sofa, one single mark, the heel missing as if the heel did not exist. Online, a thread about a hostel in East Austin, where the host always answered messages at times no one normal kept, and where the attic door had been nailed shut with finish nails small enough to make you forgive them. In every story there was a person at the edge, either a man with a bucket who knew where the mildew bloomed, or a cleaner who arrived early and humming and left the room smelling like eucalyptus and sugar. They were helpful, they were respectful to the point of invisibility. They did not like ladders. If there is a neat ending, I do not have it. What I have is this: on our last night in the little South Austin house, the man with the bucket finished scrubbing and coiled the hose and turned the spigot with a careful, practiced motion. He stood with his hands on his hips for a second and looked at the back wall as if admiring a painting he had helped dry. Then he stepped toward the shed and paused with his hand on the lock. He looked back at us, saw us seeing him, and let his hand fall. He smiled a little, not a threat, something else, the recognition that we were all going to tell a version of this, and he tucked the brush under his arm and walked to the side gate and left without the creak I knew the hinge would make. We drove away believing that the host would never leave the property because the property was not a street address. It was the space above your head where you think sky begins, and it is not sky yet. It is where your breath makes an echo, only when someone is listening so close they forget to make their own. At 3 in the morning in our house now, there is a stretch of quiet that wakes me because of what stops. Then comes the small careful slide of hair against fabric, and the shallow hitch through a nose. It waits when I hold my breath. It starts again when I do. When it is bad, I put a chair under the hatch because the body wants to feel like it has done something. When it is worse, I open my phone and type to a host who never has a face, and I tell him we are uncomfortable, and the little dots appear and then stop, and I can feel the reply assemble in words I already know. I close the phone before it arrives, and I lie there and listen to the house learn me, and I understand that whatever is up there learned the shape of a person in one place, and then learned to follow that shape into the next, and the next, that the property is a person, and the person is me. When I cannot stand it, I go to the kitchen and turn on the faucet, and let water make a sound big enough for my fear to hide behind. I think of the man with the bucket, and the way the hair hung for a second on the fence when the hose caught it. I think of the bag in the attic, tied shut with careful loops, someone's patient collection of what falls off us when we are not looking. I think of what it must mean to live your days attentive to the little leavings of other people. I picture a shed with a lock, and a shelf with mason jars of screws, and a stack of painter's tape and earplugs, and a roll of twine, and a set of blind spot mirrors, with the backing peeled back just so. I picture the attic floor, smooth and ready, the dust pressed in the long line that a body makes when it lies down to listen to the world keep itself alive. I picture opening our hatch and seeing the small handprint smudged into insulation at the edge of the catwalk, not a child's, not a man's, the size of my own, with a finger missing where the mirror must have been held. And I do not open the hatch because I already know it is there. I run the water, and I wait for the sky to pale, and somewhere a house on a quiet street takes down an old oak and puts up a taller fence, and a listing goes live with a bowl of limes and a smiley face, and a host replies from somewhere close by that he respects privacy to the point of invisibility, and I believe him. And if you are reading this because you think you would have done something different, I hope you are right. I hope you would have climbed and opened and called and insisted until someone with a badge came to shine a light and write your name. I hope you never learn that sometimes a shape is not a person or an animal, but a way of listening that will not get off you once it knows your rhythm. I hope you never feel the moment when the air above you makes the small human hitch through a nose and waits for you to do it back. I signed the lease because of the windows. Anyone who knows San Antonio knows the heat presses in like a hand on your chest by mid-afternoon. And if you don't have light, you feel the squeeze twice. The loft sat on the second floor of a converted mattress factory on South Flores, brick like old bread crust, iron staircases that rattled in a way that made me feel like I was doing something right with my life. The landlord, a slow-talking guy from Floresville named Vince, said the windows were original, 12 feet high, many-paned, rippled where the glass had sagged against time. When I first walked through, dust hung in the beams like a light fog, and for a second I thought I was looking at water. That sense of a body of water inside a building appealed to me. I told myself it meant the space could carry a mood, and I needed a place big enough to hold mine. You don't think about your reflection until you see it in a new place. In the first week I caught myself in everything. The oven door, the metal elevator doors in the lobby, even a puddle out back after a short storm rolled in and reminded everyone that heat sometimes breaks. I saw a man in his 30s with tired eyes that didn't pay back all the sleep they owed him. I saw the little hesitations in my face when my mind trailed down certain paths. I thought moving would reset the clocks on all the things that had been knitting me tight. It did not. It just changed the room. The mirror came from a junk shop off Fredericksburg Road. I had wandered in because the place had a hand-painted sign that said Lightning Furniture in a script that felt both wrong and honest, and I wanted to see what that meant. Inside it smelled like wood rot and lemon cleaner, which is two fights that cancel each other out. The mirror leaned at the back with a halo of dust on the floor that showed the last time it had been lifted was not recently. It was arched at the top, the wood frame carved with a pair of vines that twisted to meet at a knot. It looked like a church window. If the church had grown out of a tree, the glass wasn't flat. It moved like water inside the frame, wavy, tremulous, shifting what it saw in a way that made your brain want to correct it and then give up. The woman behind the counter told me it had come out of a house in King William that got bought and gutted to make something easier to clean. She said that with a kind of bitter shrug, as if the city had asked her permission and then ignored it. The price sticker said $60, and I said I'd take it. She glanced at me, then at the mirror, then said 60 would be fine, but she'd throw in the quilt folded on the bench because it had been following the mirror around the store like a lost dog, and she was tired of stepping over it. The quilt was ugly, browns and greens that didn't agree with each other, stitched in a pattern that gave up halfway through and started over with a different idea. I took it anyway, because the way she said following made me feel like I was on a small path I should keep walking. I strapped the mirror into the back of my truck with more care than anything else I owned. When I got it into the loft, leaning it against the long wall across from the windows, I realized why it had been cheap. The glass had a dark oval bruised into the lower right side, like a stain from inside the silvering that came and went depending on how you stood. If you looked straight on, your face hovered over that shadow. If you shifted a step left, the oval pooled and it was like your shoulder sank into it. I told myself it was character. I told myself to stop being precious. I leaned the mirror just so, to catch the morning light and throw it back into the middle of the room. It worked. All that brightness sat in a circle on the floor and gathered dust motes into a slow constellation. The first night I slept there, the freight trains sounded farther away than they had when I came to look. The floor was warm from the day. I lay on top of the sheets and listened to the building talk. Old wood answers itself when the air cools, pipes tick, bricks keep their heat and let it go in size. I must have drifted because I woke to a noise that sounded like the chuff of breath through teeth. A second later I realized it was the elevator somewhere down the hall. The old cage clanks and sometimes you hear the cable whisper if the window is cracked. What grew my attention was not the elevator. It was the quiet afterward, a stillness like the building had leaned forward to listen and decided it had heard something about me. I rolled onto my back, looked across the room at the mirror, and saw a smear of movement go through it in the dark. It was probably a stripe of headlights making a careless visit from the street below. That is the reasonable explanation I settled on in the moment. But when I got up and walked over, there were no headlights on the bricks, no angle for it to have come from. The mirror reflected the darkness with a depth that made it feel like I was looking into a room with the lights off. My face appeared when I came closer, out of that black. I waited long enough to feel foolish, and then went back to bed, telling myself the same thing you tell a child you care about when they say they heard something. You didn't. Sleep. The days settled into a rhythm that involved coffee and long walks, I did freelance layout work for a couple of small publishers and a non-profit that never paid on time. That meant schedules that were strict and then not, long stretches of focus followed by useless hours, where trying harder made everything worse. I learned the noises of the building. The couple above me had a dog whose toenails clicked on the floorboards in a pattern that repeated if you listened long enough. The guy at the end of the hall played a guitar at odd hours, and he was better than he thought he was. The elevator had its own personality that leaned toward melancholy in the morning and grew cheerful after sunset. The mirror sat polite and still in its place, throwing the light around as if that was its only purpose. I avoided looking into it longer than necessary. Not because I was scared, because it made me think about my face and I was trying not to. It was a Saturday in late September when it stepped one notch from odd to wrong. I had been out most of the day because the air had turned in that way that convinced the city it remembered how to breathe. Every sidewalk felt suddenly occupied by a version of the same man in a hat and the same woman with a paper cup of iced coffee. I came home grateful that my apartment faced a quiet block. I made pasta by boiling it too long. I ate it out of a bowl with too much garlic. When the sun lowered and the factory roof across the street went from orange to red to iron, I turned on the lamp by the couch and the big overheads that made everything look like an inspection. I glanced up while I was rinsing the bowl and caught the mirror showing me the room. The buildings outside were soft rectangles, the couch was a warmer shadow. The plants I had bought as lies about my character looked like paper cutouts someone had taped to the windowsill. My head passed through the frame of the mirror as I moved, and for a split second I saw someone standing to the right of the mirror in that dark bruised oval. It wasn't even the shape that startled me. It was the stillness. People shift, they put their weight somewhere, adjust as they stand. This figure did not. It was there the way marks are there on the inside of your eyelids when you stare too long at something bright. I turned and looked to the right of the mirror. Nothing. When I turned back, the figure was gone, but a slight impression of a contour remained in the stain, like white on black, as if the stain had been actually black and someone had drawn an outline of where to stand in chalk. I went closer. It was only the way the silvering had thinned and pooled, the way age makes puddles in things. I put my fingers on the glass. It was cooler than the air and the impression vanished because I had changed the angle of the light with my body. I told myself the room was playing a trick, and I had fallen for it like an eager tourist. That night I slept, then woke, then slept, the way you do when you drank coffee at 7, because you were lonely, and then pretended it was because you needed to work. I woke around 3 to the sound of water somewhere. Dripping. Not steady. That insulting irregular drip that says I will not be predictable, and you will keep listening. I went into the bathroom. All faucets were closed. I checked the kitchen sink, dry. The air conditioner had kicked off and the loft had that thick quiet you can feel on your skin. I found myself standing in front of the mirror because I had fallen into a routine of checking it when I walked past it, the way you tap a pocket to make sure something is inside. I couldn't see myself as well as I could see the room over my shoulder. The glass in the mirror wasn't a passive thing, it moved in small ways like it had slow weather inside it. I stood there, letting my eyes adjust. The window across from the mirror showed a slice of street lamp. The mirror took that light and made it meaner. It cut the room into sharper edges. There was a shape in the lower right, crouched maybe, huddled. I shifted to see if the shape would slide along its tricks. It did not. It stayed where it was, and my chest went cold in the way a room does when someone opens a door in another part of the house and lets in weather. I spoke out loud because silence had started to feel like the other side of a conversation I didn't remember starting. I said okay. I said that word the way people do in fights when they are not agreeing. Okay. I put the light on and the mirror went bland. It reflected the lamp, the couch, the plants that had started to give up on me. It reflected me and my face heavy with a tired that felt borrowed. I stood there too long, and then went to bed. On Sunday my sister called. She lives outside Houston and has kids who know words I don't. We do a thing where we talk about nothing for 30 minutes to say the parts that matter in ways that don't. She asked how the new place felt. I said big. She said that was good. I nearly told her the thing about the mirror and realized how the sentence would sound coming out. The mirror shows a person who isn't there. She is not a person I would like to see concerned. I told her about the windows instead. She told me to send pictures. I said I would. Once I learned how to take a picture that made sense of how the light came through. Later that afternoon I noticed something that I am embarrassed took me that long to see. The mirror never showed me directly if I stood square in front of it. If I centered myself in the arch, the wavy glass slid in a way that softened me, and that strange bruise, the dark oval in the lower right, grew deeper. But if I stepped left or right, if I eased myself off center, my reflection sharpened into someone I recognized. It was like the mirror did not like lines that knew where they were supposed to be. I experimented like an idiot, facing it from different angles, standing at a distance, moving closer. I watched the stain move like a shadow that doesn't belong to you. And then when I leaned in enough that my breath fogged the glass for a second, I saw hair in the stain. I stepped back with that sudden jolt you feel when something makes a decision about your body without asking. I stood farther away and stared. The hair was not a trick of wood grain in the room behind me. It was not a reflection of anything in the glass. It was inside the darkness in that bruise. It hung slightly forward from a head, long, the kind you see when a woman pulls it around to tie behind her neck. It did not move. It was not my hair. I said her out loud by accident. It felt like a word that had been sitting at the back of my throat waiting for its cue. Her. The loft, which had been quietly spacious as a church between services, went small. I have been alone a lot, and I know the flavor of that feeling. This tasted different. I stepped left. The hair stayed. I stepped right. It stayed. I crouched and the angle changed, and for a fraction of a second I saw what the hair was attached to. A cheek like pale wood. A mouth I couldn't see a shape to. A jaw that did not fit my sense of human jaw, not misshapen, but set with a severity that did not have room for casual things. And then it was gone because I was breathing, and my breath fogged the glass again, and the light changed, and the room betrayed me like rooms do. I did not sleep on Sunday night. I lay with the lamp on until the bulb burned hot and lazy, and made that high, thin sound old bulbs make, and I watched the rectangle of the ceiling. Somewhere upstairs the dog's nails tapped and I pictured a small creature politely requesting attention from a god that only sometimes answers. Around 3 I got up to drink water and did not look toward the mirror. Around 4 I fell asleep and dreamed of a theater where all the seats faced a stage with a mirror on it, and someone behind the mirror walked past without crossing the glass. On Monday I took the mirror down. That makes sense to say, like a responsible thing a person does when the object in a room is contributing to their unease, but taking it down is not what it was. I put my hands on the frame and I felt with a clarity I am ashamed to write, a desire not to. The wood was cool and slightly oily, and the knot at the top where the vines met looked like something that would be warm as skin if touched. I lifted anyway. Not because I am brave but because I felt the stupidity of not doing it. The mirror was heavier than it looked. I dragged it along the wall and leaned it inward, so the reflecting side kissed the brick. As soon as I did it made a sound. The glass did. It was not a creak. It was not the whine of age in wood. It was a muted tap like someone had placed their fingernail against the glass and then lifted it. I stood still and listened. I told myself mirrors will make sounds when you put pressure on them. The cheap wood flexes and the glass answers. I waited. The sound did not happen again. I left it there, turned away and walked to the kitchen. I made the kind of breakfast you make when you want an hour to pass without noticing. Eggs, toast, coffee, the whole routine like a small play where you are the only audience, and you clap at the end for yourself because nobody else will. When I finished eating, I walked back into the main room and stopped. The mirror leaned where I had left it, face to the brick. My eyes told me it had moved an inch to the right. They told me that because the little half-circle of dust that had formed at the base when I dragged it over was no longer perfectly matched to the wood, an inch of clean floor showed. The kind of shift that happens if a building settles or a truck passes outside or a person changes their mind about small things. I stood there, knowing how stupid those words sounded even in my head, and watched. I did not see it move again. I went to work at the table. Small books about small subjects needed attention. Fonts had to be coaxed into behaving next to each other, and margins had to be offered reasons to be where they were. A couple hours passed and the mirror lived quiet on the wall. Then the fire alarm in the hallway chirped. Not a full alarm. That one battery is dying chirp that can ruin a day with its insistence. I went to the door, opened it, and listened to the building breathe against my doorway. The chirp happened again, and it was not in the hall. It was in my apartment. I went back inside, and as I crossed the room, the mirror made the muted fingernail tap again. It came from the glass side facing the brick. You tell me how I knew that, and I say I do not. The sound had a shape, and the shape was the place it came from, and I could feel the flatness of it inside my teeth. I stood with my hand on the frame. It tapped again. Not a code. Not a rhythm I could write down or hum later. The kind of sound humans make when they want you to notice that the thing you are ignoring has not stopped existing. I had the urge to pull the mirror away from the wall and stand it upright again. The urge was not curiosity. It was courtesy. If someone on a crowded bus touches your sleeve to get by, you step aside. I did not like having the urge, but it made sense to me. I did not move the mirror. It tapped again and then stopped. The battery chirp did not repeat, and I counted minutes to see if I could measure the distance between reasons. 5, 7, 10. Noon came and the light grew high and my windows cooked and the room smelled like hot paper. I stood up, poured the last of the coffee, and realized the urge had not left. It had pooled somewhere behind my ribs and settled so that when I breathed it lifted and fell with me. I carried my cup to the sink and moved in a careful way as if the floor might protest. When I turned around, the mirror did not move, and I realized I had expected it to walk across the floor like a stubborn relative. Around 4, I admitted that I was waiting for something that would not tell me when it would arrive. I lifted the mirror and turned it so it faced the room again. My arms shook with the weight more than the effort, like energy had taken a step out of phase with gravity. I leaned the mirror back where it had been. It stood there, still, the stain in the lower right like a bruise that had settled into someone you are too late to help. For the first 30 seconds nothing unusual happened, and then a woman stepped into view. She did not walk into the room. She did not appear in real space. She showed herself in the mirror with the certainty of anything you consider already present. If you have ever seen someone arrive before you hear them and had the feeling that they had been there for longer than you had noticed, you know the feeling. She stood in the lower right, mostly within the stain. Hair long and pulled forward the way I had seen, hanging like a curtain with weight to it that said it had been washed and combed like any other person with hair might do. A face pale and not unfriendly, though there was no friendliness in it either. A mouth that looked soft and unused. Eyes that did not shine. No scars, no ghost wrought to dramatize her for you. She was plain, and that was worse. I did not move. She did not look at me. She looked at the room. She looked at the window and the plants and the couch and the table. When her eyes came to the mirror, they did not register surprise. She already knew it was there. I said hello, and the sound of my voice hit me like someone else had spoken. She turned her head a fraction, not enough to be fully facing me, enough to say she had heard a sound she recognized. Then she lifted her hand, slowly, human slow, to the frame of the mirror inside the reflection, as if she knew exactly where the wood should be and exactly where her fingers belonged on it. She did not touch the glass. She set her hand on the carved vine, the same place where I had set mine when I first brought the thing home. The same coolness moved along the air between my hand and the frame, as if the wood had carried it through from the other side like a draft. I did not step closer. It is important for me to write that. I did not lean in. I did not call or wave or test what would happen if I tried to occupy the same space as her. I did not, because I knew in a part of my body that only speaks when you have run out of better senses that it would be rude, and that rudeness here would be a mistake I could not fix. I watched. She stood with that quiet, weightless poise that some people have when they are waiting on good news that has already happened. The light changed. Dusk comes in San Antonio in a way that feels both quick and stretched. One moment the edges of things are crisp with heat. The next there is a deepening that makes spaces under tables significant. Somewhere a neighbor laughed and the sound came through with a body to it. I realized my mouth was dry in a way that tasted like I had been breathing through it for too long. I swallowed, and the woman in the mirror finally moved. She lowered her hand from the frame and stepped backward. Not away, deeper. Which should not make sense but will if you imagine someone in a photograph taking a step into the background of the photograph while the picture remains the same size. The feel of depth in the mirror increased as if space was being added to it from behind. She receded until the stain absorbed her, and the stain then seemed to settle back into its original borders like a pool left alone. I walked to the window and opened it because I needed to hear something unmade by me. The street noises came up, good and usual. A bus, a car stereo with bass that pushed the air in comfortable ways, voices, footsteps on the metal stairs outside. I stood there until those sounds made me a human being again. Sleep that night came like a fall. I expected a dream, and perhaps I had one and do not remember it. What I remember is a sound like hair pulled through a brush without being attached to anything, and then the feeling of fingers passing through a bowl of water. The next day I did the thing you do when the world introduces itself in a new way. I told nobody. I acted like nothing had asked me to change my mind about what reality was like. I made coffee. I answered emails with a kind of forced competence. I moved through the loft in the careful way of someone who has not yet put broken glass into a dustpan. At noon I faced the mirror because the day had started to feel thin without that confrontation, and I did not want to be someone who avoided what they knew. The mirror showed my loft. It did not show the woman. In the stain I could now see a depth I had not previously noticed. It was not depth like a receding room. It was depth like water that looks the same until the color changes and you know the next step could drown you. I walked across the room and put my hand on the frame where she had put hers. It felt like wood, and it felt like a hand that had been warmed by someone else recently. Not hot, that would have been easy to understand, but holding a memory of heat, latent, like the long side of a pillow you turned a few seconds ago. I kept my hand there too long because I realized I wanted to do that and not because it had a result. Nothing happened. And that was a moment inside the moment that gave me the information I hadn't wanted. The woman was not going to show herself because I wanted her to. The mirror was not something that performed. I moved the mirror into the bedroom because the living room had started to feel like a place where eyes wore grooves. Inside the bedroom the mirror leaned across from the bed. I told myself it would help me get used to it by soaking me in the sight of it until my brain would absorb it into the background like any other piece of furniture. If I write that I knew this was also bringing the thing into the space where I slept, you must believe I understood that too. Want and fear. Here are neighbors and sometimes they share a fence.
I wanted her to come back in a way that had nothing to do with romance or thrill. I wanted to know what was there so I could stop circling it in my head like a stray dog circling the place where meat had been.
Nothing happened for 3 days. The loft got hotter, and then the rain came through for an hour and made the streets smell like pennies. I did the work and failed at some of it, and sent apologies that people would absorb or not. I watched baseball with the sound off. The mirror hung there in the bedroom, and gave back polite reflections that made me feel childish. On the 4th night I woke because of that feeling. The way the floor vibrates when trucks go by is different at night. You feel it through your ribs more than your feet. The elevator whispered down the hall. Another sound came that was not the elevator. It was the sound of hair combed against cloth. She stood in the mirror when I turned my head, closer than before. Not in the depth, not in the stain. In the bedroom. The mirror showed the room as it was, my bed, my chest moving with breath, the open doorway, the soft rectangle of the window, and in the lower right, she stood inside that space as if it had always been there. She looked at me. For the first time she looked at me. That attention felt like the first cold wave on a beach you thought you knew. I said hello again because my body needed to say something, and that was all I had. She lifted her hand again but did not touch the frame. She held it like a person about to make a promise they do not want to break. She opened her mouth, and a sound came out, not a word. The kind of sound people make when they forgot their voice in another room. The second sound was closer to a word. The third sound was a name that was not my name. It was a name you do not hear in bars or at playgrounds anymore. It belonged to a time with different wallpaper. She said it like you say a word you learned to read before you understood what letters are. Then she closed her mouth, and the shape of her face settled back into that not unfriendly expression it wore when it thought by itself. I said I do not know him. My voice shook on the him and embarrassed me. She blinked, slow as if processing this was not a surprise but a fact that needed filing. Her eyes shifted to the side where in the reflection, the bedroom door stood open. She looked at it the way people look at doors that lead to places they have lived. Her gaze came back to me. She raised her hand toward the glass, her fingers stopped a hair's breadth from it. She dragged that not touch upward in a line, as if measuring the height of someone small. I understood something then that I did not want to understand. The size of the person she gestured was in the space where a child's head would be if a child stood before the mirror. I said no because the word arrived before I had a reason. I do not have a child, I said to the empty room because saying it to her felt too urgent. She lowered her hand. Her face did something I had not seen it do. It softened, not with kindness, but with a careful patience like a nurse who has asked you a question and is sorry she has to ask it again. We stayed there, two people on either side of a thing we had not agreed to share, looking at each other and not knowing the rules on purpose. The sky outside lightened and became the pale gray of early. Her outline ined and outed with the changes in light. She stepped back and again that depth increased and she went somewhere I could still sense, but she was not visible. The room breathed, and I realized I had been holding my breath the way children suspect it will make them invisible if they do not exhale. I found my phone, and the clock said 5. The loft had pushed me to a place I don't like. I went to the internet. I typed questions I now think must be common because the search suggestions bloomed versions of what I was asking faster than I could finish. Antique mirror shows someone else, silvering stain lower right figure. San Antonio mirror old house King William. The results offered me the usual mix of bored humor and the rare tale told badly, but one thing caught me. A list of city auction lots from 8 months earlier. Photographs of items taken from a condemned home on South Alamo. One photo showed a mirror that was not the same as mine but had the same arched top, the vine carvings, the knot at the apex. The description said period mirror with silvering damage, believed circa 1900, removed from King William residence damaged by fire. The address of the residence was 2 blocks from the junk shop where I had found mine. The photograph of the mirror showed a room reflected inside it, a corner of a window, the edge of a bed, a quilt with ugly browns and greens. I went to the kitchen and unfolded the quilt I had stuffed into a drawer. It was the same pattern, not an exact match because quilts are made by hands and hands are not machines, but the same quarrel of colors and the same decision to start over halfway through the pattern. I smoothed it on the table and waited to feel something superstitious. The quilt just lay there, heavy and utilitarian, smelling like a house that has been closed too long. I did not go back to the junk shop. The woman behind the counter had given me what she had and I had no desire to ask questions that would either not be answered or would be, and the answers would become objects themselves in the loft. I stayed with the mirror. I began a strange practice. Each evening as the light loosened its grip I would sit in the chair opposite it, the ugly quilt over my legs, and I would wait. Sometimes I fell asleep and woke up with the quilt bunched at my knees, and the mirror only giving me my own unflattering mouth. Most nights she came. When she came she did not always look at me. She sometimes studied the room like a person writing inventory, sometimes the window like a person testing for wind, sometimes the corner by the door where a small table might stand if the room was arranged to welcome visitors. When she did look at me, I learned moods that did not belong to any expression I knew. The difference was small, changes in the set of her mouth and the angle of her jaw. Once her lips parted in a way that might have been a smile if it had anywhere to go. Once she looked briefly angry, not at me, but at something I could not see, and I felt a soft pressure in the room change by a degree, like air deciding what kind of weather it wanted to be. I tried things. I spoke, not at her but to the room, with a kind of wary dignity I hoped counted as respect. I told the room when I was leaving, and when I was back, I described what I was working on at the table. None of this was a ritual in the childish sense, it was a way to give the air shape that words sometimes give. The mirror did not answer with anything dramatic. She did not move objects. She did not write in the condensation on the window. For a week I saw no words at all and I relaxed, then she spoke again. It was after a day where nothing cooperated, and my head felt like it had been replaced by a hive that had learned English. I sat in the chair with the quilt and let the coolness of the evening sink into my ankle bones. The mirror showed the room in that soft way it began to favor, the glass doing its weird water thing that made even hard objects look like they had been told to be kind. She was there in the right, half in the bruise, half out. She did not look at me at first. When she did, she said the name again. The same old-fashioned name, the syllables like they had weight. She said it twice in the slow way you repeat for someone who needs the time to recognize themselves. Then she added a word that could only be here. I said I do not know him. I said it in the calm voice you use on a dog that does not belong to you. She nodded as if she had expected that and was practicing her patience not on me but on a schedule I could not see. Then she did the thing with her hand again, lifting it to the height of a small head, then higher. Her fingers marked the difference between then and now without language. I felt a stupid heat in my throat and the floor did that small tilt it does when something inside you decides it cannot stand and has to sit. She was telling me a child had grown. I stood up. The mirror did not change. She let me be larger in the frame and did not step back. I asked if she was safe where she was and then laughed because the sentence divided itself into parts I could not manage. She moved her head in a fraction that could have been a yes or could have been a no, and I realized I had asked the wrong question. I asked if he was safe, that made the air move.
She lowered her hand to the lower height again, the child's height, then lifted it, and then stopped, palm flat, like she had put it against a door to feel the cold. Her mouth worked. 2 sounds that were not words, then one that was. The word was mirror. I did the thing you are not supposed to do. I stepped closer and put my hand against the glass opposite where her hand had been. I did it because I needed to. Not because I thought good would come of it. The glass was cool. It felt like glass and like the idea of glass, the way certain stones are themselves and also their emblem. Beneath the cool was a kind of draw, not suction, not a pulling that any scientist would be interested in, but a small craving. The way a well will always want water even if it has just been filled. I pulled my hand back and left a print that fogged and then cleared like a breath going the wrong direction. She looked past me, then at me, then past me again to the doorway. I turned and looked. The doorway was a dark rectangle with the living room beyond it, the couch a shape like the suggestion of furniture. Nothing stood there. The mirror behind me now showed her looking over my shoulder to the same doorway, and I felt suddenly like the hinge between a door that could open and a door that could not. I said, I am going to cover you tonight. It felt less like a decision and more like a sentence I had been told to deliver. I took the quilt and folded it up and lifted it toward the mirror. She did not step back. She watched my hands climb the air. When the quilt reached the top edge of the frame and I draped it over, her face passed behind the cloth and for a heartbeat the glass tugged in a way that made my hands twitch. The quilt lay down heavy, its ugly patchwork becoming a wall. The room changed with that small act. The air felt like a book had been closed in the middle of a sentence. I slept for the first time in weeks like a person who was not constantly leaning toward a sound. I woke once to thunder far away and smiled in the dark because there are sounds that bring you back to the kid you were under covers counting between flash and bang. When I woke properly the light was already sharp and the loft hot and the air 2 degrees too wet. I took the quilt off the mirror the way you would take a blanket off a person, careful not to snag anything. The woman did not appear. The mirror was just a mirror. 2 days later the building's fire alarm went off for real. Someone burned bacon or incense or a version of themselves they did not want to be anymore. We all filed down the metal stairs and gathered on the cracked asphalt in back. The dog whose nails I had learned clicked anxiously against the sidewalk. The man with the guitar stood holding it by the neck like a child. The couple from the corner unit argued softly about whether eggs can be frozen. I saw myself as part of these people and was both comforted and made sad. The fire trucks came slower than the alarms needed them, and then arrived in a way that made the trucks look embarrassed for their hurry. When we were allowed back in, I climbed the rattling stairs and felt the fatigue of interrupted adrenaline. I slid my key into my door and stopped. The door was unlocked. I never leave it unlocked. I stood there with my hand on the knob and thought of 1,000 reasonable explanations and another 1,000 that started where reason runs out. I pushed the door open and the loft was not as I left it. Nothing dramatic. It is only in films that drawers are dumped and chairs are thrown. The difference was a small one and it stood out like a bruise on a white arm. The mirror had been moved.
It stood in the living room again, not the bedroom. It leaned at a slightly different angle than the one I had used, tilted so it caught the front door. The quilt lay on the floor folded in a neat square you could put in a linen closet and forget. My chest pulled tight and then loosed like a pulley that had seized and released. I looked around for other things moved. None. My couch seemed not to care. My table sat with its cheap confidence. My plants were still failing at their assigned jobs. Only the mirror was new in its old place. I called the landlord because I needed someone besides me to have a stake in this. Vince said he had to come in to check something electrical when the alarms went off. He was sorry he didn't call me, but people were out in back and the firemen were bossy, and he had keys. He hoped that was okay. He wanted to make sure the breaker panel wasn't going to do something ugly. I said it was fine. I said it was fine twice because I needed him to stop saying any other words. He did not mention the mirror. He would not. He had seen 1,000 strange arrangements of private life and they were none of his. We hung up and my phone felt heavy like a chunk of somebody else's day. I stood in front of the mirror with that exhausted courage that follows panic. She did not appear. I waited. The light, thin as milk, slid over the room. A fly knocked gently against the window and learned nothing. Somewhere a basketball hit an empty court with a regularity I wanted to own. I slept on the couch because the bedroom felt formal, and at 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of someone walking up the metal stairs outside. 3 steps, a pause, 3 more. I waited for the fade at the top landing. It did not come. I got up and crossed to the window. No one stood outside. The night was not windless, but the tree on the sidewalk moved in a way that did not explain footsteps. I turned back to the room, and she stood in the mirror again. She was close, closer than before. Not crowding. Her face was more visible and her eyes even less like eyes I know. They were not black, they were not holes, they had a softness to them that made me think of milk glass. Something that does not let light through even when it glows. Her mouth moved, and the sound that came out was a whisper that used the shape of the glass to make a soft scraping. The word came again, that old name, and then another word I did not know. I repeated it, and it tasted like the remnant of a spice. My mouth did not know what to do with it. She nodded, tiny, and then her hand lifted, and this time, instead of hovering near the glass, she pressed her fingers to it. The sound was a small tap like the first day, except not on the back of the mirror. Not private. The glass under her fingers made a muscle memory against mine. I did not touch. That feels important to write again. I did not. This is not the place for virtue, but restraint was a kind of dignity, and I wanted to keep at least that. Her fingers left the glass and she pointed at the doorway again. She looked at the doorway. She looked at me. She said the strange word, and the old name, and then her mouth shaped a sentence out of those 2 pieces. It was like watching someone push a heavy thing across a floor. When she finished, the room felt a small lighter in one corner and a small heavier in another. I went to the door and opened it. The hallway was tired with the hour. The elevator doors wore the kind of shine that reflects only what is directly in front of them, and gives it back with a flat meanness. The real world sat there with its reliable blankness. I came back in, shut the door carefully, and leaned my head against it the way people in films do when they are trying to look like they feel something. Nothing came. I turned around and the mirror showed me standing with my forehead against my own door. And for a moment it looked like someone else with my same outline was doing it wrong. I did not sleep again. I sat in the chair and watched the mirror until gray came and wiped everything into one color. At 11 a package arrived because the world will deliver to you even when you forget to order. It was a book I was supposed to copied it, and the editor had attached a note with a heart drawn next to my name, because she was the kind of person who believes kindness is not expensive. I wanted to hold that heart in my pocket like a stone. I opened the book and began to work as if work would press a line through the room that could not be crossed by anything not under contract to behave. Something crossed anyway. It came in as a smell. Old copal. The day after a church service when the smoke has settled into the cushions. I turned and the mirror showed the place next to the bed in the bedroom, not the living room where it stood. Inside the glass, the view was the bedroom, as if the mirror still lived there. To the right of the bed, on the floor, lay a shape I could not get my eyes to decide on. Like a bundle of laundry the way people write when they want you to think corpse and then discover towel. The shape had weight, a corner of it lifted, and fell like breathing where there should be none. My stomach went wrong, and I walked toward the mirror, although I did not tell my legs to do that. The shape in the bedroom, in the mirror, was not in my real bedroom. I could see through the doorway. The mirror was showing me a moment from a room that was not the room. As I watched, a hand reached into the frame from the right in the reflected bedroom. Slow and careful, a woman's hand with the kind of care in it that belongs to someone who has done this before. It touched the shape in a small way, like reassuring a living thing. The hand withdrew, and then the shape was lifted, invisible arms gathering it from below, and then the shape was carried out of view. I made a noise because my body had to. The mirror dropped the bedroom, and went back to showing me my living room, and I saw myself with a face I recognized from bad years. A day passed like I was at an airport waiting on a plane that was not going to land. When the light went out of the air, she came. She did not stand in the stain. She stood beside me in the mirror. If I stepped, she took account of my movement, and kept pace. It felt less like a ghost playing tricks and more like someone trying to be near without allowing touches. She looked at me, and then down, a small glance at my hand, and for a second I had the wild thought that she was going to ask to take it. Instead, she lifted her own, and her fingers showed the small tremor of a person controlling a bigger shake. She wrote something on the glass with the pad of her finger in the fog that had been gathering, and I still do not understand how my air could be on both sides like that. She wrote 3 letters, the old name without the last vowel. Then she wrote that word again, that tasted like spice. I said the name. I said the word. I watched her face, and when I said the second word, her mouth made a shape that might have been gratitude or pain, and the difference did not matter because the room changed with it. She stepped back then with a small shake like someone finishing a task they had held their breath to do. She went into the stain, and the stain became again like a bruise that wasn't healing or freshening, and I stood there with the stupid feeling you get after leaving a hospital. I slept. When I woke, it was because a human being had spoken clearly in my room. The voice was a woman's, and it said the old name with annoyance. You know the tone, the one you use when your child will not put their shoes on, and you are late. The tone was not unkind. It was tired. It came from the mirror. The mirror reflected nothing unusual. The voice did not repeat, and the silence that followed knew too much about me. I will tell you now the name as I heard it because keeping it from you will not protect anyone. The name was Alton. Say it out loud. It does not belong to boys born after a certain year. It belongs to uncles. It belongs to a photograph in a box that smells like dust. The word that tasted like spice was looker, which I tell you knowing it is not spelled that way in any language, and yet that is how it fit in my mouth. When I said it, I could feel it scrape a place behind my tongue where certain words are stored, and it felt like pulling a burr out of your sock. I do not know what it means. I know what it caused in the room. I began to look for things in the city to anchor the mirror against. I walked along the river where the tourists go, and then along the sections where no one does because the path gives up and the trees take more than their share. I sat in San Pedro Springs Park where the water is older than anyone's plan, and watched a father teach his daughter how to float. I went by the house in King William that had burned 8 months ago, and stood across the street pretending to check my phone, and stared at its empty lot like it owed me. A man on a bicycle rode past and did not look at me, and I felt grateful for the freedom to be ignored. I went home each evening wishing something would make me choose between continuing and not. The choosing came on a hot night when even the bricks were tired. I had been drinking at Blue Star with a guy from the hall who knew how to talk without asking and listened without hunting for his turn. I walked home later than I should have, and the streets looked like they were practicing being empty after everyone leaves them.
I climbed the stairs with my feet doing their best not to be too loud, and I walked into my loft and the mirror showed me already inside. You know that military trick in your lizard brain where it gets ahead of you and shows you what you are about to do so you can save half a second. It was like that. The mirror's room held a copy of my room that was ahead by the length of one breath. In that breath I watched me close the door and watched a shadow pass behind me toward the bedroom door. Then time caught up and I closed the door, and the shadow did not wait to be in both places. It slid toward the bedroom, not inside the mirror, but inside the real air. I say shadow, and I do not mean a flat thing. I mean dark. The space it took was the size of a person, and the dark of it was the kind that eats light without becoming shiny. I followed it with a stupid bravery, like a man who has had enough and wants to shut the refrigerator on his hunger by climbing into it. It moved along the floor without moving the objects it passed, and it went to the spot beside the bed where the shape had been in the mirror. It lowered. It did not sink as if gravity was making it. It lowered like someone kneeling. I felt my throat prepare to say Olton. I did not. That felt like an act for which I did not have permission. I said looker instead because the word had become a handle, and my hand wanted something to hold. The shadow turned its head, if shadows can be said to have heads, and the air in the room behaved like a sheet shaken, and then allowed to settle. The mirror reflected me, and the faint shape of the thing, because light does not know what to do with certain decisions. Then the woman's voice came again, softer than the first time, not tired now, but final. Olton, this is not for us. I am trying to write this with dignity. I am failing. I looked at the mirror like it could translate me to sanity, and saw in it a face that looked nothing like me, though it wore my features like a borrowed shirt. The shadow beside the bed lifted, and for the first time, it did something that belonged to the world of physics. It knocked the corner of the bed frame, and the bed moved, and the sound was a normal furniture sound, and my body convinced itself I had something to hold on to. I stepped forward, and then the mirror gave me the kind of gift you spend the rest of your life paying for. It showed me a room that was not mine but had worn itself as mine for a while. The same window but with older glass, wavier, the city outside less vertical. The same groove in the floor by the door where somebody dropped a tool too many times. The bed different, iron at the corners, with a quilt heavy and ugly. A woman stood beside the bed in that room, with her hair pulled forward, and her face showing the patience of people who know they will not receive what they should but hope to be paid in time instead. On the bed lay a boy, 7 maybe 8, pale in the way of children who sleep hard and ill. The woman touched his hair and then looked at the mirror, and her eyes were the same milk glass eyes, and I understood that the room showing me this had not learned that I would not be able to fix it.
In that moment, the doorway in my real loft darkened. The shadow that had knelt by the bed lifted and then moved toward me. Not fast, not slow. The pace people move when they have gotten the yes they needed. All my fine ideas about respect and not touching burned off like morning fog on a parking lot. My hands came up without asking me. The shadow reached me, and I felt a coolness like the mirror's glass, and a hunger like the well. For a second my right hand went numb to the elbow, as if I had rested it too long on a table. The word locker jumped from my mouth and hit the air, and the air did not want it. The shadow passed through me into the mirror, or it did not pass and only seemed to because the mirror took it. The woman in the mirror watched this with a face that told me this had been the plan she had been asking my room to join. The shadow was a boy. I know this because the size of it pressed itself against me in that way. You know the shape of a body, not by sight but by how it displaces air. When it went into the mirror, the woman reached her arms the way shoulder blades do when you pick up a child. She lifted the thing I could not see because light does not know how to show love and tucked it against her. Her mouth opened and she did the small bobbing motion mothers do when they are telling rhythm to sit quietly with them for a minute. The quilt moved as if it had remembered its purpose. The mirror gave me that view for a handful of breaths, and then the room and the glass shrank as if it had been on a stage that suddenly had to make way for a different act. She faded. The stain pooled and settled again with that bruise color it had loved at the beginning. I sat on the floor. My legs had learned a new way to be tired. The loft made noises like a body standing up after a long kneel. I laughed once because all the options for what to do next were ridiculous, and I had run out of the god I had been privately asking to walk into the room and sign for responsibility. I slept a kind of sleep that is neither safe nor dangerous, and does its business in that gap. When the sun flooded the windows, the mirror reflected it with a sincerity that made my chest hurt. I did the only thing that felt honest. I made coffee. I cleaned the kitchen. I brought my work to the table and finished a chapter that did not matter to anyone, and I sent it to someone who would pretend it did. In the afternoon I walked to the junk shop on Fredericksburg because I had to stand in the place where the mirror had chosen me and look at the back of the emptiness where it had leaned. The woman at the counter was there, reading a magazine that had nothing to do with anything. She looked up and her eyes did that little change certain people's eyes do when they are good at minding their own business and have decided to mind yours but not tell you they are doing it. I asked where the mirror had come from again, and she told me the same burned house on South Alamo story, and then added a line I don't think she remembered to tell the first time. The family had lived there for a long time, a woman and her mother and a boy. The boy had been sick, not scary sick, tired sick. The mother, who was the grandmother, had died one spring, and the woman raised the boy alone after that. I asked if she knew their names. She did not. She said names have a way of leaving with houses, and sometimes that is part of a bargain. I asked if anyone else had asked about the mirror. She smiled in a way that made me feel both seen and protected and said people ask about all kinds of things, shoes, radios, teeth in a jar. Why would she keep track of who asked what about a mirror? I thanked her and left. I walked home through different streets on purpose because I wanted the city to lay new tracks in my feet. When I climbed my stairs and opened my door, the loft looked like someone had taken a picture of a place that would look good on a listing. The mirror leaned in the living room as it had stain in the lower right, reflecting the big windows and the couch and the table, and me standing there with my hand still on the doorknob. In the surface of the glass there were smudges at the height of a child's hands, 2 of them, side by side, the way children do when they test what a surface will do for them. I went closer until my own reflection wanted to kiss itself and I could see that the smudges were on the inside. My hand lifted and then fell. I sat down in the chair and the loft breathed and the day became night in the slow way normal days do when you let them. She did not come that night, she did not come for a week. I told myself all the normal lies and then called them lies out loud in a room that did not object. I went to work. I ate. I slept. In my sleep sometimes I felt a small weight at the foot of the bed, the way a cat will settle there and decide for you that your legs belong to someone else now. If I woke and turned on the light, nothing crouched there, nothing ran away. The air smelled like clean, like the hour after rain. Twice I woke with my hand on the quilt as if it had been folded onto me by someone who knew how not to wake people. On the 8th day she came again. She stood where she had so often stood, and this time her face had in it a calm I had not seen. The eyes were still the same milky color that made me think of windows with wax paper taped over them. The mouth was a line with a kindness in it that did not require teeth to show. She lifted her hand and this time pressed her palm to the glass with the quiet firmness of someone saying goodbye with a touch and not wanting to make a speech. Against my rules and because I am not pure, I lifted mine. I held it a fraction from the glass so that if the world shifted by a bug's width, I would not be guilty. I felt a coolness that was not the room. The stain around her deepened and then thinned and then became the kind of shadow you expect from old silvering. She lowered her hand. She looked at me like one human being looking at another across a noise too loud to talk over. She said the old name once, then the strange word, then she said a word I knew. Thank you. The way she said it made me think she had learned it in a hurry. That might be a place to end if this were a different kind of story. A thing asked, a thing given, gratitude, quiet. But you know from the title and from how life is shaped that endings are seldom placed in nice chairs. 2 nights later I woke to a sound I have not heard since and hope not to again. It was before dawn, that hour when the city tests its alarms one at a time. The sound was a small cough, not a smoker's manifesto. A child's questioning cough. It came from the foot of my bed and it came out of me seconds later in the form of a sob that scared me because I did not expect my body to adopt sounds from other bodies so willingly. I sat up and the room was just the room. I said, "Who is it?" because I am an idiot. Nothing answered. My hand found the quilt and pulled it up like pulling the blanket higher would hold weight. The mirror was blank in the light from the street. I got out of bed. My feet found the places in the floor that do not complain. I stood in front of the mirror ready to be a person. The mirror showed me a tall man with hair that needed cutting, and behind me it showed the bed, and at the foot of the bed it showed a small shape sitting with knees drawn up. The bed in the mirror had the quilt I was holding right then in my hands. The small shape sat still the way kids sit when they are trying to be good because a room is not theirs. I turned fast and nothing was there. The bed looked like the animal it is when no one is inside its pen. I faced the mirror again, and the small shape was larger now because it had stood. The stupidest thing I have done in all of this was the next thing. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and found the one straw I own because I think straws are kinder, and I carried them back to the mirror like a person who believes they have the job. In the glass in the mirror a small hand appeared. I put my hand against the glass with the water between, and felt the cool of the glass through the glass as if doubling a sensation will replace it with meaning. The hand took the glass on the other side. Not mine. The mirror made a small decision and flashed with a stain that had not been there, and then it was only a mirror again with me holding a glass to it like a fool. I set the glass on the nightstand and pretended that was a normal place to leave water and went back to the chair like a man taking a seat at a performance he had not purchased a ticket for. After that the mirror became the smallest part of the room. The bigger part was the wanting. Mine. Theirs. The way the air would lift some afternoons and a sound like small feet in hallway slippers would go by the door. The way a laughter too brief to be laughter would catch on the corners of the window frame. The way my work began to show margins closer to the edge than was wise because I found myself cheating space. The woman came less. The child never showed except as a shape at the edge of seeing. The city went about its wide business, and I had the small private one of waiting on something that had chosen not to tell me its schedule. One morning a slip of paper lay on the floor by the mirror. It had been folded and did not look like a thing that had fallen there so much as a thing that had landed. I picked it up in the state of mind you enter at museums. I unfolded it. The paper was old in that way pulp gets, soft and liable to bruise. The handwriting made letters like old schools make with tails that understood their job. The note was a list. It said flour, soap, matches, camphor, pennies for the river. On the back someone had drawn a square with a smaller square inside and written window at the top. In the smaller square the name Alton was written twice, then crossed out on the first and circled on the second. The circle was smudged where a finger had been, as if someone had pressed there to remember.
I do not know how to explain what that did to me except to say I went out and walked the city until the sun decided the game had gone on long enough and sent me back. I looked at faces. They looked at phones. I looked at doors. They looked at me or through me depending on the hour. On Mission Road a man was trying to sell peppers out of his truck and no one was buying, and he shrugged like the day was a shirt that did not fit. I walked home past the place where the house had burned. It is a fenced lot now with grass that has decided it will not argue with the dirt anymore. A child rode by on a scooter and his mother walked behind him, and I wanted not to be the kind of person who would make a wish involving people who do not know me. I went upstairs and put the note into the frame of the mirror between the wood and the wall. It fit like it had been waiting for a pocket. We are close to the end and I will not pretend I can make it wise. It was a Saturday again, like the calendar wanted to be symmetrical. The day had been busy with nothing. I arranged books I would not read. I called my sister and listened to my niece tell a story about a goat that had learned to open a gate. I ate with the kind of appetite that comes when your thoughts have been walking. Night came and with it the mirror's shallow depth. The stain in the lower right had thinned the past weeks until it was a suggestion. I sat with the quilt and did not expect anyone. It is always when you do not that it happens. The mirror gave me first a warmth like a candle had been lit inside, then a figure like a bend in it. Then her. She stood there and her face was not the calm face. It was the face of someone who has finished a job that took longer than it should and is bracing for what the bill will be. She lifted her hand and I lifted mine because we had become dumb at choreography. We did not
touch. She looked at the door, and then at the foot of the bed, and then at me. She said the name Alton. She said it clean. She said the strange word lacquer. She said the word that might have been mirror. And then she said a sequence of sounds that my ear could not carry. If I try to write them here, they will look like I am faking a language, and I cannot betray you like that. My eyes watered. It had nothing to do with sadness. It had everything to do with pressure, and how it will make the weakest thing break a little to relieve it. She finished speaking, and I understood one thing. This was my last night with her in the mirror. I stood. Our heads came into line in the glass, in a way that made me think of a wedding photograph where the couple are not looking at the camera, but at each other. She smiled. It was not quite a smile. It was one. You know what I mean. She reached into the stain which was not there, and pulled on something like a curtain cord. The mirror darkened at the lower right, so slow you could mark your fingernail in the wood with the pace of it. It deepened and deepened until it was nearly black, and then it cleared as if a wind had come through a room and blown dust out of the air. She stepped backward into that space. I moved forward to stop my own foot from stepping forward. She raised her hand this final time, and there was a small detail I would not tell anyone if I did not promise myself to write this without saving any of it. On her ring finger, there was a mark where a ring had been and was not, a pale circle, narrow as a thread. It was the humanest thing about her and I found myself loving it. She vanished into the depth and the mirror went to glass with a stain that had the resigned quality of a scar. I sat down. I do not know how long. When I woke on the couch because sleep had come up like a tide, the room was gray, and the mirror showed me the windows like eyes after a cry. I got up and went to the bedroom to get dressed, and that is when the ending arrived. The body in my bed was small. It lay under the quilt as if that quilt belonged to it as much as to anything. It was turned toward the wall in that way kids will sleep when the bed is too large for them, and they are trying to manufacture a corner for themselves. My brain did its tricks. It tried to make a bundle of clothes. It tried to make a leftover from some dream. It failed. The body moved. A small leg extended and withdrew, and the quilt settled over it. I said a name, not my own, not hers. Alton, I said, because what else can you say when the world has picked the word for you? A face I will not describe because it belongs to someone who should be allowed to have it without my sentences. It was neither decomposed nor radiant. It was a boy's face, and you would not pick him out of a line at a school. His hair lay across his forehead the way boys' hair pretends to be unruly. His eyes were closed. He made the cough again. I backed away from the bed because love will undo you and fear will make sure it finishes the job. I went to the mirror because I needed a surface to look at that had lied to me with some consistency. The mirror showed the boy in my bed and me with my hand on the wood, and in the lower right stain, a very small hand pressed against the glass from the other side. It patted twice in a way that was neither request nor goodbye. A new smudge joined the older ones at that height. I sat on the floor. I did not call anyone. Who would I call? I did not call the police because I have not done anything wrong in a way that makes sense, and I believed the minute I made this a matter of official record, a shape would be cut around it that would never match. The boy slept and coughed and slept. The air changed as the sun stood up. The building made its noises. The dog upstairs clicked its nails. I must have fallen asleep again sitting on the floor with my head against the frame, because when I opened my eyes the boy was gone. The bed held a dent, and within the dent a single thing I thought I understood and did not. There was a penny. Old, green, with the idea of copper. It lay there like a coin left on a grave by someone who liked a ritual. I picked it up and felt that it had been held by a hand that had been warm. I put it on my nightstand, because I am a man who has habits. The mirror showed me doing this, and did not offer comment. The quilt lay like a quilt does after it has been wrapped around a small body that needed it. In the weeks since then, the mirror has been what mirrors become when their decision has been made. It shows me brushing my teeth and failing to keep plants alive and working, and sometimes remembering to breathe like other people do when they are not noticing whether they are doing it correctly. Now and then at the edge of me, I see something else. A corner of a dark shape. The impression of someone leaning their shoulder against a doorframe. Smudges appear lower than I can make them, and I wipe them clean, and then later there they are again, and I leave them because they are not my glass to be proud of. On a Wednesday in January, I went to the river at night because the air had finally learned how to be cold. I stood by the water the way a person stands when they think they can make the shape of the city turn by holding it in their eyes. I took the penny out of my pocket, and then put it back in. I did not throw it into the water. I am not interested in promises between me and anything I cannot chit with. I did buy a pack of matches on South Floors on the way home because the list had said matches. When I got back to the loft, I put them on the table under the mirror just because. The next morning they were gone. There was a smell in the room like something had been said over smoke, and the day went on and no one died. Sometimes in the hour before the freight trains find each other with their heavy clanking speech, I find my reflection in the mirror. I look older now in a way that makes me both ashamed and grateful. Behind me sometimes I see a woman's head tilt in the direction of a door that is no longer there in any house that stands. Sometimes I wake to the weight on the bed of a cat I do not own, and I put my hand there, and it finds the quilt and the warmth that does not belong to me. Once in the reflective face of the oven door, I saw a boy walk past me into the living room. There was no boy in the living room. The mirror showed the windows, and the windows showed the building across the street, and the building held its heat and did not tell me what it does with it. When people come over, which is not frequent, they do not comment on the mirror. I think it asks them not to. When I tell you that sometimes in the morning the glass shows the outline of an iron bed in the place where mine stands, you can decide if you believe that, and I will not be offended if you organize it into a shape that fits better in your day.
I am perhaps not the same as I was. A man in the hall nodded to me yesterday and asked if I had been sleeping better, and I said yes because the truth is slippery, and he is not my confessor. A final thing, hopeful or not, I do not know. Some nights the mirror is only glass and I am only a man. On one of those nights I woke at 3:17 to a small knocking on my door. Not the metal stair outside. Not the elevator deciding to remember me, not the pipes thinking about winter. 3 knocks like a tiny hand asking the politeness of entering. I went to the door and opened it to the empty hall. No child stood there or woman with long hair or smudge on the metal that would make a story easier to believe. But when I closed the door and went back to bed, the quilt slipped in a way that felt like something had taken a corner of it and pulled it up to my shoulder. I lay on my side and felt the small cold press of a coin under my pillow that had not been there and that I did not move. I did not move because I had understood something, or I decided to understand it because deciding is all we get. The woman in the mirror had wanted to make a room continue that had been interrupted. She had needed my room to help. The boy had wanted what boys want in the deep middle of night: no heroics, no Bible, a hand, a glass of water, a quilt, a body in the next bed that will be there when the cough is not.
When the morning comes, the mirror will show me the windows, and the windows will show me the street, and the street will pretend it is no one's business where the dark goes. I will lift the penny and put it in my pocket, because I have learned that you do not leave your part of a bargain lying around in plain sight. If you come over and ask to see the mirror, I will tell you it came from an old house that burned, and that it has a stain in the lower right, and that in the wavy glass, sometimes your face looks like it is remembering you. If you stand there long enough, you might see about what I saw, and you might not. I have come to think that the woman was not a haunting the way people like to say those words. I think she was a person who ran out of places to put her care and learned how to make a new one. I think the mirror taught her. I think she taught the mirror. I think maybe every room is only a room until someone asks it to do something with love that costs them. A last thing, and then I will close the door on this. There is now a spot on the lower right of the mirror where the stain used to be. It is clear there. A small imperfect circle like a window scrubbed by a hand that did not have much time. If I stand close and look through that circle at the bed, the foot of it looks closer than it should, and the dent in the quilt that sometimes appears in the morning is in that circle even when it is not there in the bed. I have not put my finger there. I have not pressed. I have learned a version of patience that the woman wore even when her eyes had no light. Maybe it is not patience. Maybe it is the lesson of houses and rooms and glass and rivers. That there are shapes we are allowed to hold for a while and to return is part of the holding. That there are words for which our mouths will never be ready, but we will say them anyway, because a hand asks us to. That when you are needed you will know before anyone thinks to tell you, and when you are not needed you will be allowed to continue. Every now and then, just as I am falling asleep, I think I hear the small sound of a match being struck and the quiet breath a mother makes when she blows it out, so a room can grow dark in the right way. I tell myself that is the building. I tell myself it is the street. I put my hand on the quilt and do not move it away. The mirror shows me that, and I see in it a man who is not alone and is also not with anyone, and that is not a contradiction you need me to solve. If one night you come home and your mirror shows you someone who is not there, you might think of me. You might think of the price on the tag and the heaviness of certain kinds of wood and the way children cough. You might speak a name you do not know and a word that tastes like a scrape behind the tongue. You might wait without touching. You might not. If the hand comes back and pats the glass twice from the inside, you will learn you have already agreed. If it does not come back, you will learn it again. I booked the place because it looked like every other neatly staged Dallas rental, a square of light and plants wrapped in white paint, all gloss and throw pillows and labeled baskets. The listing had a picture of a kettle on a butcher block island and an open laptop with a mug beside it, like the kitchen itself was telling a story about productive mornings. There was a metal sign in one photo that said "Gather," and another of a matte black showerhead pouring over green subway tile. It was in Oak Cliff, west of the river and south of downtown, on a quiet street with pecans and hackberries that leaned across the road like gossiping neighbors. The map pin showed it near a park. The neighborhood had reeled through decades like a boxer who learned to punch back. It had old houses with screened porches and a taco stand at the corner where men in dusty jeans leaned against their bedsides after work. I was in town for a meeting I didn't want to attend with people I didn't much like. I told myself the rental would be a small grace, a neutral space where I could stack notes, rehearse what I'd say, sleep late, and leave without anyone knowing my real name. I picked this one because the reviews said things like spotless and quiet block and host is very responsive. The host's name was Peter, the profile photo a chin and a collar, no smile, a single sentence in the bio, "I like things orderly." He confirmed my request within a minute. He sent the door code with a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder that checkout was at 10 a.m. sharp. I arrived at dusk in late September with the sky bruised purple over the Trinity and the smell of wet earth coming from somewhere, even though it hadn't rained. The street teetered between careful and tired. Somewhere, someone's wind chimes knocked like a spoon in a glass. A dog barked 3 houses down, bothered by the way the air changes when a stranger drags a roller bag up a walkway. The rental was a little shotgun thing with a short driveway of gravel that creaked under my shoes. Lights were set on timers. They glowed with a warm temperature that suggested intention, the way a staged house asks to be bought by your better self. Inside was what the photos promised: an L-shaped couch with a blanket folded at a perfect diagonal, a narrow kitchen with knives in a magnetic strip, each knife blade reflecting the under-cabinet lights, the kind of blades you want to believe are only for tomatoes. A chalkboard by the door said "Welcome Riemann," which I hadn't told anyone was my name. The platform asked for your legal name and preferred, and I had clicked through too fast to check what it saved. The neat handwriting with the curl on the capital R made me feel seen in a way I didn't want. Beneath it, checkout 10 a.m., late checkout fee $200, no exceptions, underlined twice. I texted Peter that I was in. He wrote back within seconds: "House rules are in the binder by the TV. Let me know if you need anything. Please remember checkout is at 10. It read like a man pressing his thumb on a bruise to check whether it still hurt. I typed back, noted, and set my phone face down. There is a private relief in living inside someone else's idea of order. I lined up my toiletries on the green bathroom tile and watched condensation purl on the mirror while the shower warmed. I hung my dress shirt on the back of the door and saw, in a sliver of reflection, that I was not as young as I imagined. There are days when the mirror returns you at a strange angle, when your outline doesn't match the draft you carry in your head. I looked at the notch in my ear where I had ripped an earring on a locker latch as a teenager, and thought about how bodies keep inventory. I thought about my father, who had died in Karachi while I was on a conference call in Islamabad, and how, in the moment before my sister said the words, the air in my office had felt suddenly thin. I thought about the way grief rearranges furniture in the house of your mind but leaves no fingerprints. I shut off the water, toweled dry, put on a t-shirt, and ate takeout tacos at the counter while a ceiling fan whispered above. I slept badly the first night. New places pull on old threads. The house made small sounds I tried to honor as the harmless sag and stretch of an old structure. The fridge compressor thumped. The air unit coughed like an old smoker before settling into its steady hum. The street gave me a late car now and then, and once a man's laugh that cut off too quickly, as if someone pressed a finger to his throat. Somewhere near 1 in the morning, I thought I heard a footstep in the hallway. It was the particular creak of weight transferring on a board, the difference between wind and a human body. I held my breath and waited and told myself it was the house learning me. After a time I slept. The second day, the meeting went the way these meetings go, everyone pretending to be helpful while sneaking glances at their phones. A man with cufflinks explained a chart I had made, then thanked me for the clarity of his insight. I nodded and took notes and wished him an honest nightmare. I walked back to the rental at dusk through the old grid of streets where the power line sketched low black strings, and the porch lights came on one by one with the sigh of another day agreed to. Back in the kitchen, I poured a glass of water, and noticed the knives again. They were clean but had the faintest suggestion of use, those hair-thin scratches that catch under light like scars on a cheek. I ran a fingertip near the edge of the chef's knife without quite touching it, and felt the ghost of a cut that never happened. I was up late, rewriting slides for the next morning, when my phone buzzed. It was Peter. "Hi. Just confirming you will be out by 10 a.m. tomorrow." There was no punctuation, like a breath held. I responded, "Yes, I know the policy." He replied, "Thank you." I wrote, "Is there a reason you're checking twice?" He wrote, "I've had problems." Then, as if he saw the shape of a misunderstanding, he added, "Not with you." The period after that felt like a hard stop. I put my phone face down again, but I could still feel the messages in the room, the way an unplugged TV still holds static on your face if you lean close. I slept with the window open a crack, the mesh screen giving me the city's breath without its teeth. The wind smelled of lawns and distant tires, and something else beneath, a mineral damp I couldn't place, not rain but the memory of rain. When I finally fell under, I dreamed I was late for a flight, and had to run through a field of rooms, each with a different bed and headboard, each with a person sleeping who would not wake to let me pass. I woke to the sound that is not a sound, the feeling of being looked at. It cut through the fan and the fridge and the breathing of the night in a way that felt deliberate. I lay still as a stone and counted to 10 and opened my eyes. He stood at the side of the bed with the knife angled down in his right hand and his left hand tucked against his chest like he was trying to hide a bleeding place. His eyes were open too far, showing white where none should be, and in the slack of his mouth was a smile that had been forced to work overtime. He wore a polo shirt, and the kind of jeans bought in a pack of 2, and a hat that should have been funny, a straw thing with a sun-bleached band. Up close, it looked like it had absorbed a season's worth of sweat and had never properly dried. The knife was the chef's knife from the kitchen, the one from the strip. He whispered, "It's past checkout," and carefully rested the tip against the quilt as if threatening to puncture a waterbed. The whisper had no wind to it. It was a voice pushed through a narrow gap, like air escaping a tire. The shape a scream wants to make in your throat is messy. It has a child's edges. I kept it down because I had not yet understood what kind of story I was in. The part of my brain that writes bullet points spoke first. I said, "It's 2 in the morning." He whispered, "We don't do late checkouts." His face tilted in the dim unblinking. The knife pushed a tiny tent into the quilt. I tried to identify the smell. It wasn't the green soap or the detergent. It wasn't metal. It was like a damp cloth in a closed drawer. He said, "It's 10:12, and smiled wider, and for a second I couldn't find my name or the shape of the room. The shadows seemed to have shuffled themselves. I looked at the digital clock on the dresser. It read 2:07. The colon blinked a heartbeat. I said, "Look, it's not 10. Do you have the wrong day?" He whispered, "We don't do late checkouts," and in the gap between his words the whole city seemed to hold a plank of silence over its head to see if it could carry it. I sat up very slowly, and reached my hand not toward him, but toward the lamp. He slid the knife a degree to the left, not a threat but a correction, the way a driving instructor taps the wheel when you drift. I said, "I will leave right now. I will go sleep in my car." He shook his head, the hat tipping, and whispered, "Fees apply."
He looked over his shoulder toward the doorway without moving his feet, as if he might take direction from something behind him. There was no one there. The house held its breath. He whispered, "I like things orderly," and something in the way he said it was so small and so lost that I found myself saying Peter. And then, because when you name a thing you either give it power or you take some back, I said it again. "Peter, please." The knife moved. He drew it up off the quilt and glanced at its edge with the tender focus of a man checking a shaving nick in a mirror. His left hand tightened against his chest, the fingers gripping a fabric I couldn't see. When he turned the blade, a short bead ran along the steel and gathered at the heel. My throat closed. It was water. The line of it trembled with the air and fell to the quilt, darkening the fabric. He looked at it as if I had spilled something. He whispered, "There's a schedule, checkouts at 10, cleanings at 12, arrivals at 4, he said, each like a prayer. He said, "If you leave late, the next person can't come in." His mouth worked again at a smile. The blade tipped like the needle on a metronome. He whispered, "Do you understand?"
I nodded. My hands were visible above the blanket. I said, "I will leave. It will take me 2 minutes. I will leave everything as it is." He looked past me toward the nightstand and then down the line of the bed as though measuring a seam. He whispered, "They won't let me." I asked, "Who won't?" He whispered, "The ones who come after." His lips barely moved. His eyes didn't blink. From the street, a car rolled by with a bad wheel bearing that gave out a hollow whine like an animal that knows it has to keep moving. The sound stretched and thinned and disappeared. The kitchen's small hum came back shamefaced, like a child returning to a game it had abandoned during an argument. Somewhere, a train called out a 3-note complaint. We waited together. It was, in the dumbest way, intimate. I said, "Could you put the knife away?" He whispered, "It has to be ready." His left hand pressed tighter to his chest. The fabric under his palm, the fabric I couldn't see at first, resolved itself at the edges. It was a folded towel, a small white square that had been held there so long it had gone gray. One corner was burned. The shape of a hand showed as a darker print, 4 fingers and a thumb, each a shade deeper than the towel, as if it had absorbed years of sweat and never been wrung. The towel made me think of hotel housekeeping. The burn made me think of a steam iron pressing too long on one spot because the person holding it had been thinking about something else. Then he whispered, "I'm supposed to clean." He said it with a shame that pulled something in my gut. He whispered, "If they stay past 10, I get behind." His left hand relaxed. The towel lifted as if in a small wind that wasn't there and settled again against his chest. The knife wavered and steadied. I don't know why. I asked what I asked next. It felt like stepping across a chalk line in a game you realize has rules you don't understand. I said, "Peter, did something happen?" He tilted his head. I said, "To you." He looked past me down the length of the bed again, then back to the doorway, as if tracing the path of a person who had walked in and out too quickly. He whispered, "They said I didn't respect the guests. They said I entered without notice." Then, very carefully, he added, "They said I stood too close." The knife made a soft metal sound against the wedding ring he wore as if it had brushed it. I noticed there was a nick in the gold. He whispered, "I'm learning." I couldn't stand that I understood him. I said, "You came in while I was sleeping." He whispered, "Yes, it's easier to see if things are in order when there are no gestures." He said, "Gestures like it was a foreign word." He whispered, "People are messy." He looked at my suitcase on the chair. He whispered, "I fold towels with the crease at the bottom. I tuck the sheet with a triangle." He angled the knife a hair to the right, as if correcting more drift I couldn't feel. Then he whispered, "The last time I let someone stay until noon, they accused me of theft." He looked down at the blade again. Water, another bead, ran from the bolster to the tip and fell. It struck with a sound too loud for its size. I said, "Are you bleeding?" He shook his head too quickly. The hat slipped and he caught it, reflex as automatic as a heart tug. Under the hat, the hair was thin, the towel lifted again and settled. He whispered, "It's the roof, it keeps sweating." I wanted to tell him roofs don't sweat. He whispered, "It started after they found." He pressed the towel hard against his chest, the voice failing there not with sorrow but as though a word couldn't fit through the narrow opening he had left for it. I said, "After they found what?" He looked at me in a way that made me feel like a drawer sliding open too far and falling out. He whispered, "The fee." The way he said it made the bottom of my feet feel wrong, as if I had stepped on a floorboard that was too cold for the season. I said, "The late checkout fee." He nodded, the hat brimming shadow over his eyes. He whispered, "If you don't pay it, it stays in the house. It doesn't feel like money, but it has weight." I sat up more slow so he could see my hands. The digital clock said 2:11. I could hear my blood in my ears, the tiny pulse that sometimes mimics a distant bass from a car on a Friday night. I said, "I'll pay. I will pay the fee." He blinked once, finally, the first and only time. It looked like a man remembering how to sleep. He whispered, "It's not that kind." He looked at my open mouth like I might argue in a way that would waste our time. He whispered, "You pay with hours." The house had not looked old when I walked in with my roller bag. Now the edges seemed chewed. The paint around the vent showed a faint ring where something had stained the ceiling and then been wiped in circles until the circles became the history. The air didn't move. He whispered, "If you sleep past 10, the house keeps the unpaid piece. It adds to the next. Someone always pays." His left hand clenched, the towel smudged darker where his fingers gripped. He whispered, "It's cleaner if I take it at night." I thought of the reviews I had read, spotless, quiet, responsive. There had been one 3-star review, a single line I had skimmed because I had wanted what I wanted. It had said, "He came in at 3 a.m. to remind us about checkout." I had assumed it was a lie. I had assumed it was drunk anger. That line in my memory now sprouted a shadow. I said, "The platform won't allow," then stopped because what good is a policy in the mouth of a man with a knife who believes he is housekeeping in the house of time? I said, "Peter, I will leave right now, and you will not have to take anything." He watched me. His face did not soften. He whispered, "It's already passed." He lifted the knife a fraction. I flinched. He whispered, "I won't cut you." There was impatience in it like I had missed a step. He whispered, "You owe the house 13 minutes. There was a relief in the specificity. It shrank the terror into something I could fit in my palm. My math did itself. If I had woken 3 minutes past 2 when he said 10:12 and the subtraction was wrong, maybe time here ran like a road under construction, switching you back and forth without a sign that made sense from the driver's seat. He moved the knife toward my chest in that small corrective way again, and I understood the motion was not a threat but a metronome. He was keeping time. He whispered, "Start." The tip hovered above my sternum. I said, "Start what?" He whispered, "The payment." He looked at my eyes like we used to look at clocks on walls in classrooms waiting for the second hand to jerk and release us. He whispered, 13. If you breathe wrong, we start again. 13 minutes is not long. 13 minutes with a knife hovering a hand's width above your heart while a stranger whom you have called by name orders your lungs as an ocean whose shoreline moves away when you walk toward it. My breath refused to be told. It wanted to race when his hand twitched, to hold when his shoulders stiffened, to hide when the hat bristled like a small animal. He whispered, "In, out." The blade barely moved, but a drop of water formed on it and trembled, swelling round, taking longer than it should to fall, as if gravity were considering its options tonight. By the 6th minute, according to a clock I didn't trust, my teeth hurt. By the 9th I understood that I could die in 1,000 ways that would look like sleeping wrong. By the 11th,
I thought about my father again and the way he had sometimes stood over my bed when I was a child to wake me for school, his hand near my shoulder, not touching, because he believed in autonomy even at 6 years old. He would say my name once and wait. He would not shake me. He had the patience of a man who had missed too many trains to stain another morning with hurry. Peter whispered, 12, and I wondered who had taught him to count. The drop fell. It darkened the quilt. He whispered, 13.
He stepped back. The knife lowered. The towel dragged across his chest where his hand again pressed it. His eyes shuttered. Not a blink but a slow drawing down of something in the face that made him look for a second like the profile picture with the chin and the collar. He whispered, "Thank you." He said it with sincerity that looked new. I moved my legs over the side of the bed and felt my knees threaten to quit. He whispered, "You can rest until morning, then check out at 10. His voice slowed on 10 like a wheel encountering gravel. He looked at the knife, saw it now as a prop that had concluded its scene, and he stepped backward toward the door. Water ran from the blade in a thin river, falling with soft ticks into the carpet that would not show stains. He whispered, "Please wash your dishes," and slipped out of the room with a pivot that suggested he knew the exact distance from bed to door, because he had measured it in another life with a tape. I sat there with the clock throwing its polite call-in at me. I could feel the breath we had counted still ringing in my ribs. The window's crack admitted a strand of cooler air that brushed my ear like a mother who had gone somewhere and come back with a new version of her hand. I stood. I walked to the kitchen in my bare feet, the boards giving me that particular creak, and set the knife back on the magnet strip with the others. It hung there with the calm of an object that had always been an object. The counter had a ring where a wet base had stood, the exact size of the knife's handle, but no puddle on the floor, no damp on the towel rack under the sink. The towel Peter had pressed to his chest was not there. On the chalkboard, under checkout 10 a.m., someone had written "fee cleared" in a smaller hand that looked like a child's letters copied off a page. I planned to leave right then with the bone-hard logic of a man whose nerves had been soldered too hot, but I sat on the couch to put on shoes and the weight of the minutes landed suddenly like someone else's coat thrown across my shoulders. I woke to the milk-white light of 7:30, and a dream of a woman whose hair was wet and whose lips were the color of a bruise. I brushed my teeth, folded the blanket as it had been folded, wiped the water from the edge of the sink with the back of my hand. I checked the closet for the laundry bin and found a single black trash bag half filled with what looked like rags. They were towels folded into neat squares. The top one had the shape of a handprint in a darker shade, 4 fingers and a thumb. The corner was burned. I closed the closet and told myself a story about cleaning chemicals and hotel supply stores, and tried not to think the word evidence. At 9:40, I started the car to let the air kick cold. The heat already had waked this early. The sky was brutally clean, as if a storm had been invented elsewhere to spare us anything interesting. I ran back inside for my charger and looked automatically at the magnet strip. The chef's knife was gone. I went still for a count of 3. I looked at the sink to see if it was there with a peel of onion for a disguise. The sink was empty, polished. The binder on the TV stand was slightly ajar. That is the kind of detail, small as a scratch, that your brain might not capture if you were not as practiced in seeing tidiness as a kind of code, but Peter had trained me in 12 minutes to pay attention to margins. I opened the binder. There was a page that had not been there the first night, a laminated sheet tucked behind the house rules. It was titled "Checkout Procedure." The letters were printed, but the punctuation, small, strange pauses, felt like the whisper in my ear. The steps were simple: strip the bed, place towels in laundry bag, wash dishes, turn off lights, lock door. A final line read, "Late checkout fee may apply if you do not vacate by 10 a.m. The next line was handwritten: It said, "We'll settle it at night." I left. I drove to my meeting. I watched a woman with gel nails argue that the number of visits to our site mattered more than whether any of those people stayed. I wanted to tell her the house of the night had a different metric. I wanted to tell her that there are economies we pretend are made of digits and invoices, when really they are measured in breath. I should have booked a hotel for my last night. I should have. I didn't. I told myself I had already been through the darkest part, and that the rest of the story would behave. This is a terrified man's bargain with the world. It worked once. It might work again. And there was the other thing. The thing that had come with the relief of the counting. There had been a spine of order to that terror. Like pain managed by a nurse you trust, it had held hands with a procedure. If I did what he asked, if I honored the 10, I would not owe anything to the house. I set an alarm for 6 a.m. and 2 backups. I stacked my clean dishes and a small sculpture of a conscientious tenant on the rack. I rolled my socks tight and lined them in the suitcase like a row of eyes. I locked the bathroom door out of habit and unlocked it immediately because it felt like trapping something I might need. I ate a bowl of cereal standing up and discovered that milk at night holds a childhood sorrow that tastes like going to bed too soon. I turned off the lights and stood in the wash of the street lamp through the window and watched moths find their version of faith on the glass. I didn't try to sleep. I lay on the bed with my shoes on and my keys on my chest and watched the colon on the clock scissor time into edible pieces. Around 2 the house made that similar sound. Not a sound but the feeling of a gaze that matches your height. I sat up slow. He was there at the door before my eyes could fix the outline. A dark figure cut from the room's dark with the brim of the straw hat a pale coin where the streetlight reached. He didn't come to the side of the bed this time. He stood in the doorway as if he had learned to keep a polite distance. The knife was in his right hand angled down. The towel in his left was folded so tight it had edges. He whispered, "It's a minute early." And I understood he meant his arrival. The correction mattered to him. I said, "I'm awake." He whispered, "That helps." He looked past me to where my phone lay on the nightstand. The alarm set like landmines that would not explode because nothing I had set could detonate in this space where the clock belonged to someone else. He whispered, "Are you leaving at 10? I said, "I am." He nodded, almost a bow. He whispered, "Good. We can settle the small balances now." The word small balances made a ridge under my tongue. He stepped into the room 3 paces and stopped at the same distance, as if a tape measure clipped to his belt had taught him where to stand. The hat's brim made a sharp shadow across his eyes like he preferred to keep the line of himself under control. He whispered, "You washed your dishes?" I said, "Yes." He whispered, "You wiped the sink?" I said I did. He whispered, "Thank you." The knife stayed low. He whispered, "There's still 2 minutes." I did not ask from what. He would have had an answer that used the stranger math of this address. He whispered, "Breathe." There is a point in being managed by terror when your body gives itself to the rules in exchange for the promise of an end. He counted like a man stitching. The blade caught a strand of light and the droplet formed and fell and formed and fell. 2 minutes is almost nothing when you are talking to a friend in a parking lot. It is forever when a stranger's whispered numbers are the only thing holding the night from snapping. He whispered, "Done." And for a second I was embarrassed by the gratitude that rose in me, the way a hostage thanks his captor for letting him pee. He turned to go. I said, "Peter." He stopped. The hat brim held its neat arc like an orbit line drawn in a textbook. I said, "What happened with the fee?" He was still. Then he whispered, "They found it under the bed." My skin pulled tight. He whispered, "They complained. They left a review." He spoke the last like a sacred text, a punishment with permanent ink. He whispered, "They said I was obsessive." He turned the knife once and looked at it not as a blade but as a pointer in a presentation. He whispered, "I took the money to be safe. They said it wasn't money.
They said it was left over time. He put his head down as if he remembered shame in the muscle. He whispered, "I cleaned after." He looked up. There was a scuff on his forehead. I hadn't noticed. The kind of mark a doorjamb gives a man who is carrying something too big alone. He whispered, "The roof dripped for days." I told him roofs don't sweat. He whispered, "This one learned." He glanced toward the hallway. He whispered, "They came to check. They said I had entered without notice." He looked at his ring. The nick caught the light. He whispered, "I was trying to be timely." I wanted to tell him how small and specific meanness can be when it is aimed at a person's way of keeping order in a world that won't. I wanted to tell him that I believed he had done exactly what they had said, and also that there is a line between kindness and control. You don't know you've crossed until you're on the wrong lawn with a key you can't justify. He whispered, "I like things orderly," and the towel lifted and fell. He slipped away before I could say more. I lay there until the window found its lighter gray. The first bird saw the change and told the others it was time to be themselves again. The alarms on my phone went off one after another and made no sense in the new day. I shut them with my thumb. I folded the sheet into rough triangles and put it over the footboard like a flag. I tied the trash bag and set it by the door. I put the suitcase in the car and came back for the charger I had almost forgotten, because what haunts us most are the small things we leave plugged in, feeding an emptiness that has nothing to power. At 9:59, I stood with one hand on the knob. I waited out that last minute with the patience of a man who believes in rituals. When the clock on the stove ticked to 10 o'clock, I turned the lock, pulled the door, and stepped into heat that made the inside of my nose sting. A man 2 houses down was watering his lawn with a hose, dragging it by the neck across the grass, the water darkening the blades in a path that looked surgical. He looked up and nodded. I nodded back. I put the bag in the trunk, climbed in the car, and watched my own face in the rearview for a second, like I was making sure I was still attached. I drove north on I-35E because that's what the maps told me to do. The air in the car smelled like rental upholstery and my deodorant. The sky offered nothing but certainty. At a red light in Deep Ellum, a woman crossed in front of me with a child on her hip and a grocery bag hitting her thigh with each step. The child turned his head and met my eyes with the solemn intensity babies have when they don't yet know what anything means, and so can see that everything does. I wanted to tell him to sleep when he could. I would like to say that was the end, that I checked out on time, paid the cleaning fee, left a review about responsiveness, and drove home with a weird story to tell at restaurants when the wine turned good. The world is not as linear as we need it to be to feel safe around knives. 3 weeks later, back in my own city, in my own bed in my own apartment with its smell of my particular dust, I woke to the shape of a person at the side of the bed. My heart broke itself in a single blow. I was ready to say Peter with a relief that felt like betrayal of the other men I had loved, but it wasn't him.
It was a woman whose hair hung in wet ropes as if she had slept in a lake, and whose lips were the color of healing. She held a small knife, not a chef's knife, but something you'd use to slice fruit. She whispered, "It's past checkout." And even though the room was dry, a drop formed and ran down the blade and fell to the hardwood with a tick that echoed in my bones like a pendulum. Behind her, in the doorway, the shape of a boy stood, shoulders too narrow, hair that looked like someone had dried it badly with a towel that smelled of old heat. He whispered, "Mama," but it sounded like a name he had been given too late. The woman looked at the clock on my dresser. It said 3:17. She whispered, 4 minutes, and the knife tipped, and I understood with a clarity that made a sound in my head that the fee was not a local ordinance but a contagion, and that I had carried it out of that neat square of Dallas with my charger and my folded socks. For a week, I did not sleep. For a week, I watched the colon on the clock and tried to be the kind of man whose breath could not be billed. On the 8th night, I dozed, and they came again. Not always the same. Sometimes a man with a hat, sometimes the woman with wet hair, once an old person whose eyes held the blue of hospital gowns, once a child with a towel held like a cape, once no one at all, only the drip, drip, drip on the floor that left no mark in sunlight, but left me with the feeling of having paid something that had been mine. I began to order the objects in my apartment the way the binder had taught: knives hung in a neat hard row, towels folded with the crease at the bottom, sheets tucked with a triangle. I made the bed with more care than I had made anything. On the fourth night of this ritual, the figure who came stood at the door, respectful, the knife down, and counted with me without moving closer. He whispered numbers I knew, and then, at 13, he whispered, "Thank you," and the drip did not fall. I had paid in preparation. I deleted the platform app from my phone. I wrote a review, and then saved it as a note because I didn't know what system of stars a story like this deserved. I told myself I would not travel for a while, and then I traveled, because money has laws. In a hotel in San Antonio, with carpet that smelled like lemon and feet, I found a small handprint on the bleach-white towel, a faint damp shape as if a child had pressed it down to see whether a ghost could leave its mark on something that had been boiled. I took the towel to the desk and asked for a new one. The clerk smiled, and said of course, and looked past me at a clock on the wall that showed 3 time zones. I went back to Dallas on purpose. This is the part I couldn't tell anyone who loves me because they would say it was obsession or harm. It was both. The house was still on the platform. The photos had been refreshed. The chalkboard now read "Welcome, Kyle" in different handwriting. The listing mentioned updated linens and a new roof. The reviews were still for the most part 5 stars. One said, "Host messaged several reminders about checkout, but otherwise great." Another said, "Loved the quiet block." A third said, "Kitchen knives very sharp." 3 words that in the mouth of a different week would be innocuous and now felt like a threat in a friendly room. I booked 2 nights for November. I arrived with a bag filled not with clothes but with time I had banked the way animals store fat. I had slept properly for a month, lights on, alarms set, breath counted like a prayer at the end of a pier. I had learned to make my nights clean. It was colder now. The pecans were bare. The wind behind my ears made a small song with the hair there. I let myself in with the code. The air smelled of fresh paints, chalk and lemon cleaner, and something underneath, an old damp like a book that had fallen in a sink and been dried with devotion but never lost its buckle. The magnet strip held the knives. The towel on the oven door was folded with the crease at the bottom. At 2, he came. He stood in the doorway, with the hat and the knife and the towel, and whispered, "It's past checkout," and sounded, for the first time, tentative. I sat up and lifted my hands and said, "I know." I said, "I've been paying ahead." He tilted his head. The brim made that precise shadow line across his eyes. He whispered, "That helps." He looked like a man in the hallway of a hospital waiting to be told what part of the visitor chart he belonged to. I said, "Peter, I came to ask you something." He didn't move. I said, "Who charges you?" His mouth did a small spasm. "I have only seen on men who were working hard not to cry." He whispered, "They do." He looked toward the floor, under the bed. He whispered, "They left it there." He took a small step into the room. He whispered. I picked it up. The knife angled slightly toward the floor, and for the first time I noticed the small notch near the tip, the sort of bite a blade gets when it hits bone or a ceramic plate edge. He whispered. It looked like money. He said it with a child's defensiveness. He whispered. I was behind. I was drowning in linens. He pressed the towel to his chest. He whispered. When I turned it in, they said I had taken time. The word turned a corner and found a hallway I had known but never walked. I said, "Peter, where is your body?" He looked at me with a kind of gratitude, so pure it made me feel like a thief.
he whispered. They wouldn't tell me. He said it like a student whose paper had been graded wrong and who wanted to argue for the points back but had forgotten how to cite the source. He whispered. They said I didn't respect boundaries. He looked at the magnet strip. He whispered. I like things orderly. He took another step. The blade lifted. The water gathered and fell. He whispered. You owe 12 minutes. I said. I know. He whispered. Breathe. And we counted, together, a choir of 2. At 9, his voice caught. At 10, he steadied. At 12, he whispered, Thank you, and then, startling us both, he whispered, I'm sorry. The knife lowered, the towel relaxed. He turned as if to go and stopped, like a man who has forgotten if he turned off the stove. He whispered, The roof doesn't drip as much when they pay. I said, I know. He nodded. He whispered, I didn't know what kind of house it was when I signed. He glanced at the binder. He whispered, I thought I could keep it clean. He left. I slept until dawn and woke to the particular taste of a decision. I stripped the bed. I folded the towels with the crease at the bottom. I opened the closet and took out the black trash bag filled with folded, hand-printed squares. I carried it to the car and put it in the trunk. I did not leave a note. I drove to the Trinity and parked where the levee holds the river in a polite straight line and the downtown towers make a city out of light. I carried the bag down the slope with the early walkers and their dogs watching in that way. People watch a man carrying a trash bag to water. At the bank I opened it. The towels smelled like iron and lemon and old heat. The handprints varied. Some small, some so large the fingers were blunt where they ran off the edges. I took them out one by one and laid them on the gravel. The wind moved the corners. The sky shifted. A woman in a parka slowed, and then, deciding I was not an emergency, walked on. I gathered the towels again and waded into the water up to my shins, where the mud gave a sucking complaint and the cold convinced my heart it was safe to sprint. I held the bag under, pressed it with both hands and watched air push up in silver coins that burst without sound. The towels took water fast and then, as if remembering another density, took it slower. I kept my hands on the bag while the river worked. The current spoke around my legs. A train went over the bridge and shouted. When my fingers went numb, I let the bag go. It lay low in the water, less a shape than a cloud, and then it moved, as if an animal under it had remembered a path. It slid downriver, toward the turn near the old industrial land and its strange clean fields. I stood there, until the cold told me my bones had opinions. 2 nights later, back in my own bed, the woman came again with the little knife and the wet hair. She whispered, "It's past checkout," and then looked down at the blade as if surprised to see it. No droplet formed. She looked at me with an expression that was, impossibly, like a woman who has been released from a line and doesn't yet trust the absence. The boy stood behind her with his towel cape. He said, "Mama," and it sounded like the right shape of the word. She lowered the knife. She whispered, "Thank you," in a voice that now had some wind, and they stepped back into the doorway and were gone.
For a month, no one came. I slept like a man. No one was billing. I woke to the normal dysrhythmias of a city, and not the syllables of debt. Then, one night near 3, Peter came. No hat, no towel, no knife. He stood in the doorway and looked smaller, as if he had returned a borrowed coat and found that his own fit. He whispered, "Thank you," and I said, "You're welcome," and he gave me the smallest smile that looked like the first true thing he had allowed his mouth to do in years. He whispered, "They found me." I said, "Your body." He nodded. He whispered, "They said I'd been in the attic the whole time." My stomach turned. He whispered, "The roof was sweating because the duct leaked." He said it as if telling me a punchline from a world where things can still be ordinary. He whispered, "It dripped on me, and I thought the house was crying." He looked at his ring. touched the nick with his thumb the way a person checks the chipped edge of a mug they'll never throw away. He whispered, I was wrong about some things. He took a breath without counting it. He whispered, but the fee is real. I said, I know. He nodded, and looked at the magnet strip in a room that was not there, and then back at me in a room that was, and he whispered, please check out on time, and the way he said it was so gentle and so final that I understood the rules had changed. He turned to go and then stopped and said, your sink has a drip, and I laughed, sharp once, like a man who has been touched on his bare neck by a friend in a dark theater. He faded in a way that did not look like smoke or light or the cleverness of film, but like a man walking backward down a hallway, until the door closed with a sound you would not notice during daylight. I went to Dallas 2 more times after that for reasons unrelated to orders or ghosts. The listing disappeared and then returned under a new host name, with new photos where the knives did not show. A review mentioned noise from the roof during rain. Another mentioned a faint stain near the vent that the host promised would be painted soon. I drove past the house at dusk and watched light in the window where the chalkboard had been. I thought about walking up and knocking and telling whoever answered to treat the towels with respect. The last thing is this. When I sleep too late now, when I give myself to the sweet heaviness that comes after a hard week and ignore the phone's alarm and the sun making its plain case, I sometimes wake with the sense of someone at the side of the bed, a whisper soft as tissue in my ear. It says, it's past checkout, and it means nothing about knives or fees or rooms that change shape at night. It means in a voice I have come to find useful that I am losing time I meant to spend being alive. I do not say thank you to the air. I do not apologize. I swing my legs over, feel the floor's honesty under my feet and stand, and when I travel, I leave by 10. I strip the bed, I fold the towel with the crease at the bottom, and I do not look for handprints because if you go looking for proof you will end up living in a courtroom where no one rests. I lock the door, I carry my bag to the car with the feeling that something has been settled for now. At the first light when someone crosses with a child on their hip, I look at the clock on the dash and check whether the colon is blinking in time with my heart, and it usually is. Then I drive, counting without counting, paying what I can in breath until there is nothing left to owe.